When the walls went up, it wasn't soldiers who kept families alive. It wasn't leaders or councils or secret armies. It was women. Mothers who woke up every morning knowing there would not be enough food, knowing someone they loved might not survive the day, knowing the rules could change without warning and death could come for any reason at all. Inside the ghettos, hunger was deliberate, fear was constant, and hope was supposed to disappear, but it didn't, because women refused to let it. They turned scraps into meals, rags into blankets, whispers into lessons, and children into reasons to keep going. They smuggled food under their clothes, taught children to read in dark corners, nursed the sick with nothing but willpower, and made impossible choices no one should ever have to make. This is not a story about battles or generals. This is a story about kitchens that became lifelines, about hands that shook while lighting candles made of stolen wax, about mothers who stood between their children and starvation with nothing but courage. If you want to understand how the ghettos survived it all, how life continued where it was never meant to, then you have to start here, with the women who held everything together while the world collapsed around them. They did not announce it with sirens or speeches. It began with a knock, sharp and impatient, wood rattling in its frame before dawn. A woman pulled a shawl tighter around her shoulders as boots scraped the stairwell below. Somewhere a child began to cry, the thin sound slicing through the cold air. Outside, the city she thought she knew was already changing. Streets were being cut apart not with explosives, but with orders. By the time the sun rose, the walls had begun to exist, not always in brick yet, sometimes only in words, but just as real, just as final. In the first weeks of occupation, rumors moved faster than armies. People whispered about lists, about districts marked with chalk, about families told to pack only what they could carry. Women felt it in their bodies before it was confirmed in print. The sudden tightening in the chest, the instinct to gather children closer. Men were disappearing into forced labor details, dragged from homes, from workplaces, from prayer. Women watched them go with no idea if they would ever come back, and in that absence, responsibility fell like a weight onto their backs. Orders followed quickly, printed on gray paper and nailed to walls still warm from the sun. Jews were to relocate. Immediately, entire neighborhoods were declared forbidden. Doors were sealed, windows painted over. The sounds of the city changed overnight. Fewer footsteps, more shouting, the crack of rifle butts against stone. Families were herded into shrinking spaces, into apartments already crowded with strangers. What had once been a home now held 3 families, then 4. Women negotiated sleeping arrangements with glances and gestures, turning kitchens into bedrooms, hallways into nurseries, floors into shared territory where no one truly rested. In the districts that would soon be called ghettos, time collapsed. Within days, tens of thousands were packed behind boundaries that did not exist a month earlier. In the place that would become the Warsaw Ghetto, streets once lined with shops and cafes were sealed off by brick and barbed wire. Mothers watched from upper-floor windows as laborers built the walls from both sides, sealing people in and out at the same time. The sound of trowels scraping mortar was steady, methodical, and terrifying. Each stroke made escape less possible. In Łódź, where the ghetto would become one of the longest-lasting, women were given hours to move their families into a designated zone. Furniture was abandoned in stairwells. Pots clanged against legs as people rushed down streets thick with dust and confusion. Children clutched at skirts, at hands, at anything familiar. Women carried bread wrapped in cloth, documents tucked into bodices, babies pressed against chests that already felt hollow with fear. The city smelled of sweat and panic, of old buildings suddenly filled beyond capacity. The first nights were the worst. No one knew the rules yet. Curfews were whispered, then enforced with gunfire. Lights went out early. Women lay awake listening to the sounds beyond the walls. Cars passing freely, laughter drifting from cafes now forbidden, dogs barking at nothing. Inside the ghettos, the air was heavy with breath, too many people breathing in rooms meant for a few. Illness spread quickly. Lice appeared almost immediately. Mothers scratched their children's scalps in the dark, whispering reassurances they did not believe themselves. Men were still present in those early days, but they were marked. Labor notices were posted. Names were called. Lines formed at dawn. Women watched husbands and sons leave with tin lunch pails and hollow eyes, not knowing whether the work was temporary or a prelude to disappearance. Many did not return. Some came back beaten, silent, changed. Others were gone forever, swallowed by the machinery of forced labor camps and roadside executions. Each absence shifted the balance inside the home, and women stepped forward because there was no one else left to do it. Food became the first crisis, and women recognized it instantly. Ration cards were issued, but the portions were laughably small. A loaf of bread had to last days. Soup was stretched with water until it barely tasted of anything. Women counted bites, not meals. They learned the sound of hunger in their children, the restless shifting, the soft whimpering in sleep, the way eyes lingered on other people's bowls. Every decision about food became moral, unbearable, and constant. In Krakow, the ghetto was carved out of a working-class district across the river, its boundaries enforced with brutal clarity. Women arrived carrying what they could salvage from previous lives, sewing kits, candlesticks, photographs wrapped in cloth. The streets were unfamiliar, hostile, watched. German guards stood at entrances, rifles slung casually, their presence felt even when they were not seen. The smell of coal smoke mixed with sewage as infrastructure failed under the sudden strain. Women scrubbed floors with freezing water, trying to create order where chaos pressed in from every wall. Privacy vanished. Menstruation, childbirth, grief, everything happened in shared spaces. Women learned to endure without complaint, to shield children from what could not be hidden. When someone died, there was often nowhere to place the body immediately. Curtains were drawn. Candles were lit in silence. Mothers covered children's ears so they would not hear the sobbing. Death arrived early and often, but life stubbornly continued, and women were the ones who insisted on it. German authorities framed the ghettos as temporary, transitional, necessary. Women did not believe it. They watched the way the walls grew thicker, higher. They noticed how exits closed one by one. They listened to guards talk, careless with cruelty. Even without full knowledge of what was coming, they understood something essential. Survival would not be organized from above. It would happen, or not, inside kitchens, bedrooms, stairwells, and courtyards, led by those who stayed behind when others were taken. Women formed quiet systems almost immediately. They shared information about which streets were safer, which guards could be bribed, which hours were least dangerous. They pooled resources without calling it charity. A pot of soup passed between apartments. A loaf broken into unequal pieces and handed out anyway. Women who had once been strangers learned each other's children's names, learned who was sick, who was pregnant, who had lost someone the night before. Community was rebuilt under pressure, fragile but real. Children adapted faster than adults, and that terrified their mothers. Little ones learned not to cry when hungry. They learned which questions not to ask. Women noticed the way play changed. Games became quieter, more cautious. Dolls were made from rags, from scraps torn from old clothing. Mothers watched their children grow older in weeks instead of years, their innocence stripped away by walls they did not understand. Outside the ghettos, life continued with disturbing normalcy. Trams ran. Shops opened. Music played. Women could hear it through cracks in walls, through open windows on warm nights. The contrast was unbearable. Inside, every day was a negotiation with despair. Outside, the world pretended nothing had changed. That knowledge settled deep, a slow-burning anger that women carried alongside fear. As months passed, the walls stopped being new. They became part of the landscape, as permanent as the sky. Women marked time by seasons, by the wear on shoes, by the thinning of bodies. They learned which fabrics could be traded for food, which gestures might soften a guard's mood, which risks were worth taking. Survival became technical, strategic, relentless. There was no room for abstraction. Every day was practical, immediate, unforgiving. And yet, even as the ghettos solidified, even as the noose tightened, women sensed that this was only the beginning. The walls had gone up, but something worse was gathering beyond them. Trains could be heard at night, distant but persistent, their whistles cutting through sleep like a warning. Women held their children closer, listening, knowing that whatever the walls were meant to contain, they were not meant to last forever. Chapter 2: Mothers Overnight. By the time the walls were finished, motherhood no longer meant what it once had. It was no longer a role defined by care alone, by routine or affection or the slow rhythm of ordinary days. Inside the ghettos, motherhood became a state of emergency. A woman could wake up as a wife, a daughter, a neighbor, and go to sleep as the sole pillar holding an entire family upright. There was no ceremony to mark the change, no moment to prepare. It happened in silence, in the space left behind when men did not come home. The first disappearances were explained away as temporary. A labor detail, a registration issue, a questioning. Women repeated these explanations to children, to parents, to themselves, even as their stomachs tightened with dread. They learned quickly how fragile certainty had become. Each knock on the door carried the possibility of erasure. Each day without news stretched longer than the last. Women stood in doorways long after nightfall, listening for footsteps that never came, memorizing the sound of the street so they would know if it changed. In the cramped apartments of the ghettos, women reorganized life around absence. A chair at the table went unused. A coat stayed hanging by the door, untouched. Children asked when their father would return, and mothers learned how to answer without lying and without telling the truth. Their voices became measured, careful, controlled, even when their hands shook as they prepared food that was no longer enough for everyone. Food was the first calculation women had to make every morning. Not how to cook it, but who deserved it most. Children, the elderly, the sick. Women ate last, if at all. Hunger hollowed them out quietly, changing the shape of their faces, thinning their hair, weakening their bodies. And still they moved constantly, fetching water, standing in lines that lasted hours, carrying buckets up narrow staircases that smelled of damp and unwashed bodies. The physical toll was relentless, but there was no space to acknowledge it. Pain was background noise now. Pregnancy inside the ghetto was a sentence layered on top of another sentence. Women carried life in places designed for death, their bodies swelling even as their strength faded. There were no proper clinics, no supplies, no guarantees. Childbirth happened on floors, on tables, in shared rooms where strangers turned their backs out of respect. Women screamed in a cloth to avoid attention. Other women stood nearby, holding hands, offering what knowledge they had. When a baby cried, it was both a miracle and a danger. Mothers learned to quiet infants with instinct alone. They fed them watered-down substitutes, wrapped them tightly against their chests, rocked them endlessly through the night. The fear of noise was constant. A crying child could draw a patrol. A patrol could end a family. Women slept lightly, waking at every sound, their nerves stretched so thin that silence itself became suspicious. In places like the Warsaw Ghetto, the population density crushed any illusion of privacy. Women bathed children in shared rooms, heating water over makeshift stoves fueled by scraps of wood or broken furniture. Steam mixed with the sour smell of unwashed bodies. Lice spread rapidly. Mothers combed through hair with their fingers, crushing insects between their nails, fighting infestations they could not fully control. Hygiene became another form of resistance, another way of saying we are still human. Clothing wore out quickly. Shoes split at the seams. Coats were passed down from adult to child, sleeves rolled and pinned. Women patched fabric again and again until nothing original remained. They learned how to turn curtains into dresses, sacks into shirts, rags into diapers. Each stitch was an act of defiance against a system that wanted bodies exposed, weakened, disposable. Children changed under their mothers' watchful eyes. Hunger made them quiet, watchful, older. Play became subdued, imaginative, often centered around what they lacked. Pretend meals, imaginary markets, games that mimicked adult anxiety. Mothers noticed how their children stopped asking for things, stopped complaining, stopped being children in the way they once had. This frightened them more than tears ever could. Women became educators by necessity. Schools were banned or tightly controlled, but learning did not stop. Mothers taught children to read using scraps of newspaper, old prayer books, anything that survived confiscation. Lessons happened in whispers, in corners, in moments stolen between chores. Education became less about the future and more about anchoring the present, about giving children something solid to hold on to while everything else slipped away. The emotional labor was constant and invisible. Women absorbed fear so their children would not have to. They smiled when there was nothing to smile about. They reassured when reassurance felt dishonest. At night, after children fell asleep, women allowed themselves moments of collapse. Silent sobbing, staring into darkness, clutching photographs until their edges frayed. By morning, they rebuilt themselves and began again. Widows became common quickly. Some women watched their husbands die. Others never learned how or where. Mourning had no proper shape inside the ghetto. There were no funerals in the way they remembered. Grief was compressed, private, carried alongside responsibility. Widowed women often took in other families, other children, creating households built not on blood, but on shared survival. These networks became lifelines, especially for those who were completely alone. Mothers also became negotiators. They learned which neighbors could be trusted, which officials were corrupt enough to bargain with, which rumors were worth acting on. Information became currency, and women were its primary carriers. They traded news quietly, in stairwells and courtyards, their voices low, their eyes always scanning for danger. Knowledge could save lives, or end them, depending on how it was used. As starvation deepened, ethical lines blurred. Women faced decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Should a child be sent away if there was a chance they might survive outside the ghetto? Should food be taken from one mouth to save another? Should illness be hidden or reported? There were no correct answers, only consequences. Women made these choices anyway, because inaction was also a choice, and often the worst one. Illness spread rapidly in the overcrowded conditions. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery. Mothers nursed children with no medicine, using cold compresses, whispered prayers, and stubborn hope. Fevered bodies were held through the night, their heat seeping into already weakened arms. Some children survived. Many did not. When death came, women cleaned the body themselves, smoothing hair, closing eyes, memorizing faces they were terrified of forgetting. And still, motherhood continued. Women found ways to mark birthdays with nothing more than a kind word or a shared crust of bread. They sang softly at night, songs from before the war, songs that spoke of places their children might never see. Music filled rooms that had no warmth left, reminding everyone present that they were more than prisoners. German policy relied on exhaustion, on breaking people not just physically, but psychologically. Mothers were meant to fail. Families were meant to collapse from the inside. And yet, again and again, women adapted. They became stronger in ways they never imagined, not because they wanted to be, but because survival demanded it. By the time months had passed, the women of the ghettos no longer recognized the versions of themselves who had arrived there. They had aged years in season. Their bodies were thinner, their eyes sharper, their voices steadier under pressure. They had become something new, something forged by fear, sharpened by loss, driven by love that refused to disappear. But even as they mastered this brutal new existence, something darker loomed on the edges of daily life. Notices grew more ominous, movements more restricted. Whispers of resettlement began to circulate, vague and threatening. Mothers felt it before it was confirmed, the way one feels a storm approaching long before the first drop of rain falls. They held their children closer, knowing that whatever came next would demand even more from them than the walls already had. Chapter 3: Hunger as a weapon. The hunger did not arrive suddenly. It crept in, quiet and methodical, tightening its grip day by day until it became the dominant presence in every room, every thought, every breath. At first, women told themselves it was temporary, that supplies would improve, that ration cards would be adjusted, that someone, somewhere would intervene. But very quickly, it became clear that starvation was not a failure of policy. It was the policy itself. German ration announcements were posted without emotion, numbers printed cleanly on paper that did not reflect the reality they imposed. For Jews inside the ghettos, the daily caloric allotment was a fraction of what the human body required to survive. Women learned these numbers not as statistics, but as physical sensations. Dizziness when standing too fast, weakness in the arms, the dull ache that never left the stomach. Hunger became constant, an unrelenting presence that followed them from waking to sleep and into dreams. Mornings began with calculation. Women stood over empty cupboards, running through possibilities with the precision of accountants. A crust of bread, a spoonful of flour, a few wilted vegetables if they were lucky. Everything was measured, divided, reduced. Meals were no longer about nourishment. They were about postponement. How long could this keep us alive? How long before someone collapses? How long before there is nothing left to divide? Bread became sacred. Women hid it like treasure, wrapping it in cloth, storing it in the safest corner of the room, away from rodents and prying eyes. A single loaf could determine whether a family survived the week. Mothers sliced it into impossibly thin pieces, their hands steady even when their hearts raced. Children learned not to ask for seconds. They learned to savor each bite, chewing slowly, trying to make it last. Soup kitchens appeared, organized largely by women who understood that collective effort was the only way to fight collective starvation. The soup was thin, barely more than warm water flavored with whatever scraps could be found. And yet, people lined up for hours in the cold, clutching bowls, breathing in steam as if it were sustenance itself. Women volunteered there despite their own hunger, stirring massive pots with weakened arms, tasting nothing, making sure others received something. Hunger changed the sound of the ghettos. Footsteps grew slower, voices softer, arguments rarer, not because tension eased, but because there was no energy left for it. Children stopped running. Old people sat motionless for hours. The air smelled of boiled cabbage, of damp clothing that could no longer be properly washed, of bodies burning themselves from the inside to stay alive. Mothers watched their children's bodies change with terrifying speed. Cheeks hollowed. Eyes grew too large for their faces. Ribs pressed against skin. Growth stopped entirely. Some children shrank, their frames unable to sustain even the minimal expansion of childhood. Women touched foreheads constantly, checking for fever, for warmth, for signs that the body was giving up. They memorized the weight of their children in their arms, fearing the day that weight would feel wrong. Women ate last, always. If there was a spoonful left in the pot, it went to a child or an elder. Hunger carved them down silently. Men, when present, often received slightly more food because they were assigned to labor, but as men disappeared, women bore the full burden of deprivation. Menstrual cycles stopped. Hair thinned. Teeth loosened. Bodies conserved energy by shutting down non-essential functions. Survival became a biological negotiation, one that women lost piece by piece. Black markets emerged almost immediately because starvation creates economies, even where none are meant to exist. Women became traders, negotiators, smugglers. A scarf for a potato, a pair of gloves for a handful of grain. They learned which items held value, which could be sacrificed. Wedding rings disappeared first. Family heirlooms followed. Women parted with objects that once defined their lives in exchange for calories that might buy a few more days. Smuggling food into the ghettos was extraordinarily dangerous, and women were at the center of it. Guards were less suspicious of them, or perhaps they simply underestimated them. Women took advantage of that mistake. They hid food under skirts, in shoes, in false bottoms of baskets. Girls were used as couriers, their small bodies slipping through gaps in walls, through holes in fences, through sewage tunnels that stank of rot and human waste. Mothers sent their children out knowing the risk, knowing that a single bullet could end everything, and knowing that staying still meant a slower death. Those who returned brought back miracles. A turnip, a sack of flour, a piece of meat so rare it seemed unreal. Women cried silently over these offerings, not out of joy alone, but from the crushing weight of responsibility that came with them. How to distribute it, how to make it last, who must be fed first. Every success created new dilemmas. Hunger distorted morality in ways that haunted women long after the war. Food theft increased, not out of greed, but desperation. Mothers guarded their supplies fiercely, sometimes turning away neighbors they had once trusted. Women hated themselves for it, and did it anyway. Survival demanded choices that fractured community, even as it relied on it. Hunger made enemies of friends and allies of strangers. Illness followed starvation closely. Malnourished bodies could not fight infection. Typhus spread rapidly, carried by lice that thrived in overcrowded, weakened populations. Women nursed the sick while starving themselves, wiping brows with damp cloths, whispering encouragement they barely believed. Medicines were non-existent. Treatments were improvised. Cold compresses, herbal remedies remembered from childhood. Hope became a form of medicine, administered daily even when it failed. Children asked questions that had no answers. Why are we always hungry? When will it stop? Why can't we eat like before? Women learned how to respond without breaking. They blamed shortages. They blamed bad luck. They blamed the war. They never blamed the system openly, not in front of children, because naming it made it too real, too frightening. Silence became a shield, even when it hurt. In the Łódź ghetto, hunger became so severe that it reshaped the entire structure of life. People collapsed in the streets. Bodies were collected daily. Women stepped over them on their way to fetch water or stand in ration lines, their faces carefully neutral, so children would not see the horror reflected there. Death by starvation was slow, undramatic, and everywhere. It did not scream. It faded. Women learned the exact sound of hunger in their children's sleep. The restless shifting, the low moan that escaped without waking them fully. Mothers lay awake listening, their own stomachs burning, counting breaths, terrified that silence would replace movement. Sleep became fragmented, shallow, haunted by dreams of food that ended in waking pain. Despite everything, women still tried to create moments of normalcy around meals. They set tables even when there was almost nothing to place on them. They encouraged children to wash their hands. They insisted on sitting together, on eating slowly, on pretending for a few minutes that this was still a family dinner. These rituals mattered. They were psychological nourishment, fragile defenses against total collapse. German officials monitored starvation carefully. Reports were written, numbers recorded. The decline was not accidental. It was measured, observed, refined. Hunger was cheaper than bullets, quieter than executions. It broke people from the inside, forcing them to spend every ounce of energy on survival instead of resistance. Women understood this instinctively. They felt how hunger narrowed the world, how it reduced everything to the next bite, the next hour. And yet, women resisted starvation in ways that defied logic. They organized clandestine cooking groups, pooling ingredients to create something marginally more nutritious. They shared recipes not because they could cook them, but because remembering them preserved a link to the past, a way of asserting that life once held abundance, and could again, somewhere beyond the walls. Some women wrote about hunger in diaries, recording weights, rations, symptoms, deaths. Others could not bring themselves to put it into words. Hunger was too intimate, too humiliating. It stripped dignity alongside flesh. To be hungry all the time was to be reduced to something animal, something dependent, something stripped of autonomy. Women fought this reduction fiercely, insisting on dignity even as their bodies betrayed them. Children scavenged constantly, and women followed them with fear in their throats. Scraps found in trash piles could carry disease, but refusing them meant refusing calories. Mothers hovered near garbage dumps, watching hands dig through filth, torn between horror and relief. Survival often smelled like rot. As months turned into years, hunger became the defining feature of ghetto life. It shaped memories. It shaped relationships. It shaped the way women remembered themselves. They no longer thought in terms of days or weeks, but in terms of meals missed, meals stretched, meals miraculously obtained. Hunger became time itself, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, hunger took on a new edge. Rations tightened further. Smuggling routes closed. Markets dried up. People spoke less about surviving the winter and more about surviving the next election, the next transport. Women sensed that starvation was no longer the end goal. It was preparation. As they scraped the bottoms of pots and counted the last crumbs of bread, women began to understand that hunger was only the first stage of something far more final, and that whatever came next would demand even more from them than starvation already had. Chapter 4: Smugglers in Skirts. The first time a woman slipped through a hole in the wall, it was not courage that pushed her forward. It was hunger. The wall itself was still new then, the bricks rough, the mortar not yet fully set. Someone had noticed a gap near the ground, a place where light leaked through, a place where air moved differently, a place where, if you press yourself flat enough, you might pass through. Women stood nearby pretending not to look, their hearts pounding, their ears tuned for boots, their minds racing through the same impossible calculation. Risk death now, or wait for it to arrive slowly at home. The decision was never framed as heroism. It was framed as necessity. Children were growing weaker. Rations were shrinking. Black markets inside the ghetto had begun to dry up. Food existed outside the walls, visible in flashes, potatoes in crates, bread carried openly, vegetables stacked in markets just beyond reach. Women could smell it on the air when the wind shifted. The contrast was unbearable. And so, quietly, almost without discussion, women became smugglers. At first, it was tentative. A woman would step outside during permitted labor hours, her eyes down, her posture submissive. She memorized the patterns of guards, the rhythm of patrols, the places where tension wavered. She learned which streets were safer, which alleys offered cover, which faces to avoid. Every outing became reconnaissance. Every return, if successful, was a victory measured not in pride but in calories. Clothing became camouflage. Skirts were layered, thickened, reshaped to conceal whatever could be hidden beneath. Shoes were modified to hold scraps of food and hollowed soles. Coats were sewn with secret pockets that brushed against skin. Women practiced walking differently, adjusting their gait to accommodate the weight they carried. They learned how to breathe evenly when stopped, how to answer questions with eyes lowered, how to look afraid but not guilty. Girls were pulled into the work almost immediately. Their small bodies could slip through spaces adults could not. They were quicker, harder to spot, easier to underestimate. Mothers hated this. They sent them anyway. A girl would crawl through a gap, emerge on the other side, and run. Her heart would slam against her ribs as she dodged carts, legs pumping, breath burning. She learned the sound of a shout meant for her. She learned how to disappear into crowds. When she returned, dust-streaked and shaking, her mother would hold her tightly for just a moment before checking what she had brought back. The food itself was often pitiful. A turnip, a handful of grain, a scrap of meat wrapped hastily in paper. But each item represented life extended. Women weighed every gram, calculating how long it could stretch. They turned small victories into entire meals through ingenuity alone. Potato peels became soup. Flour became dumplings. Bones were boiled again and again until they surrendered the last trace of nourishment. Guards were everywhere, and unpredictability was their greatest weapon. Some were bored, some cruel, some corrupt. Women learned to read them quickly. A glance lingered too long. A hand rested too casually on a rifle, a smirk that suggested a bribe might work. Every interaction was a gamble. A wrong move could mean confiscation, beating, arrest, or death on the spot. Women learned to absorb humiliation without reacting, to endure groping, insults, threats, and still keep their eyes on the prize, getting back inside with something, anything, that could be eaten. Smuggling routes evolved constantly. When one path became too dangerous, another was found. Sewer tunnels were used despite the filth, the stench, the disease. Women waded through waste, holding sacks above their heads, gagging silently so as not to be heard. Holes were dug beneath fences. Bricks were loosened and replaced. Lookouts were posted, often children, whose job was to cough or sing softly when danger approached. The ghettos became lattices of secret movement, invisible to those who believed walls alone could control human desperation. In the Warsaw Ghetto, smuggling became so widespread that it sustained entire neighborhoods. German authorities knew it was happening. They responded with brutality. Public executions were staged as warnings. Bodies were left in streets. Signs hung around necks reading "Smuggler." Women walked past these displays with their faces blank, their children's hands clutched tightly in theirs, committing the images to memory, even as they refused to let fear paralyze them. Punishment did not deter smuggling. It refined it. Women adjusted tactics. They carried smaller amounts. They worked in pairs or groups. One woman would distract while another passed. They learned which guards accepted bribes of bread, cigarettes, or favors. Corruption created openings, and women exploited them ruthlessly. Survival left no room for moral purity. Inside the ghetto, women faced another danger: betrayal. Hunger made informants. Neighbors reported neighbors in exchange for food or favor. Trust became a fragile thing, extended cautiously, revoked instantly. Women shared routes only with those they believed they could trust, and even then, secrets were compartmentalized. Smuggling required community, but also suspicion. Balancing the two was exhausting. Children understood the stakes with frightening clarity. They learned when to freeze, when to run, when to drop what they carried and flee. Mothers drilled them like soldiers, rehearsing scenarios in whispers at night. If caught, say nothing. If chased, split up. If stopped, cry. These lessons were not theoretical. They were rehearsed for survival. Some women did not return. They were shot near the walls, arrested and sent away, beaten so badly they could no longer walk. When this happened, the community absorbed the loss with grim efficiency. Another woman stepped forward. Another child took up the route. Hunger allowed no pause for mourning. The psychological toll was immense. Every smuggling run demanded that women suppress fear completely, if only temporarily. They learned how to separate themselves from their bodies, to operate on instinct alone. Only once they were back inside, doors bolted, windows covered, did the shaking begin. Knees buckled. Hands trembled uncontrollably. Some vomited from adrenaline and fear. Others sat in silence, staring at walls, unable to speak. Mothers often hid the truth from children, downplaying the danger. They pretended their outings were errands, work assignments, harmless tasks. Children saw through this quickly. They noticed the tension, the relief, the way their mother's voice changed upon returning. Smuggling reshaped family dynamics. Children became co-conspirators. Secrecy became a shared language. Food brought back from outside was never consumed immediately. Women waited until night, until curtains were drawn and candles carefully shielded. Meals were eaten quietly, reverently. No crumbs were wasted. Plates were scraped clean. The act of eating smuggled food carried a thrill that was inseparable from terror. Each bite tasted of risk. German efforts to crush smuggling intensified over time. Walls were reinforced. Patrols increased. Punishments escalated. Entire blocks were searched. Women adapted again. They moved less often, but more strategically. They shifted to night operations. They bribed construction workers to leave gaps. They coordinated with non-Jewish contacts outside the ghetto who risked their own lives to supply food. These relationships were fraught, unequal, dangerous. Women navigated them anyway. Not all smugglers were young. Elderly women participated too, leveraging their appearance to avoid suspicion. Bent backs and gray hair masked sharp minds and iron will. They moved slowly, deliberately, hiding food beneath layers of clothing, counting on guards' impatience to let them pass. Age became an advantage. Smuggling blurred the line between civilian and resistor. These women were not carrying weapons. They were carrying bread. And yet, in the logic of the occupiers, this was rebellion. To feed a child inside the ghetto was to defy the system designed to starve them. Every successful run undermined the intended outcome. Every meal delayed death. The cost was cumulative. Bodies weakened by hunger struggled to endure the physical strain. Women collapsed mid-run. Some died not from bullets, but from exhaustion. The work demanded strength their bodies no longer had. And still they went. Over time, smuggling became normalized inside the ghettos. It was spoken of quietly, coded, referenced indirectly. Children bragged in whispers about daring escapes. Women exchanged tips like trade secrets. Which guard was drunk? Which route was safer after rain? Knowledge circulated constantly, evolving faster than enforcement could keep up. And yet, despite all adaptation, smuggling remained a race against inevitability. Supplies outside grew scarcer as war tightened its grip. Penalties grew harsher. Fear intensified. Women felt the ground shifting beneath them. They sensed that smuggling alone would not be enough forever. As they planned the next run, adjusted the next skirt, memorized the next patrol schedule, women began to hear new rumors carried on the same networks that once carried bread. Rumors of transports, of people taken not to labor, but to somewhere else entirely, of destinations that no one returned from. Smuggling had kept families alive through hunger. But now, standing at the edge of the wall once more, women began to realize that survival would soon demand something more than food. Chapter 5. The Economy of Survival. Money lost its meaning long before most people realized it had. At first, women still clutched coins and banknotes, folding them carefully into pockets, as they had always done. They stood in lines with currency in hand, waiting for shops that no longer stocked what money was meant to buy. It took time for the truth to settle in, heavy and undeniable. Inside the ghettos, survival would no longer be governed by law or wages or savings. It would be governed by exchange, by barter, by what could be given up and what could be transformed into one more day of life. Women sensed this shift early. They felt it in the way shopkeepers avoided eye contact, in the way prices changed by the hour, in the way a single potato could suddenly cost more than a month's rent once had. Currency became paper without power. Objects became food. Skills became lifelines. And women, who had always managed households, budgets, and scarcity in quieter ways, now found themselves at the center of a new, brutal economy that operated in shadows and whispers. The first things to go were luxuries. Jewelry passed discreetly from hand to hand, traded for flour or fat. A necklace that once marked a wedding day now bought a few meals. Rings disappeared into the pockets of strangers who never asked where they came from. Women did not linger over these exchanges. Sentimentality was a liability. Objects that once held memories were reduced to their weight, their material, their exchange value. What mattered was not what had been lost, but what might be gained. As hunger deepened, women became increasingly inventive. Clothing turned into currency. A warm coat traded for bread in winter could mean the difference between freezing and eating. Shoes were especially valuable. Women parted with extra pairs, with boots inherited from relatives who no longer needed them, with anything that could be spared. Children learned to walk in ill-fitting footwear, soles thin and cracked, because shoes had been exchanged for food weeks earlier. Skills rose in value as objects disappeared. Women who could sew found themselves in constant demand. They repaired uniforms, patched clothing, altered garments scavenged from dead bodies or abandoned apartments. A skilled seamstress could trade a day's work for a bowl of soup or a sack of grain. Knitting, mending, embroidery, once domestic tasks, became survival professions. Hands worked endlessly, fingers stiff with cold, eyes strained by low light, because each stitch represented calories. Cooking itself became a trade. Women with access to slightly better supplies prepared meals for others in exchange for portions. A single pot of soup could sustain multiple families if distributed carefully. Kitchens turned into informal businesses, their existence tolerated because they filled gaps the official system refused to address. Women coordinated quietly, ensuring no one drew too much attention. No one appeared to profit excessively. Visibility was dangerous. Balance was essential. In the ghettos, everything carried value if it could be repurposed. Scraps of wood became fuel. Paper became insulation. Glass jars became storage. Even ash was collected, mixed with water, and used for cleaning. Women wasted nothing. They learned to look at objects not for what they were, but for what they could become. Survival required imagination as much as endurance. Children were drawn into this economy almost as soon as they could walk. They ran errands, carried messages, scavenged for usable materials. Women taught them what to look for, what to avoid, how to negotiate without revealing desperation. Childhood innocence dissolved into practicality. A child who understood value could contribute. A child who did not might starve. The markets inside the ghettos were chaotic, unregulated, and essential. Women navigated them daily, their senses sharpened by necessity. The smell of food signaled opportunity. The murmur of voices hinted at new arrivals. Prices shifted constantly, influenced by rumors, raids, and weather. Women learned to act quickly when opportunity appeared, to trust instinct over logic, to recognize when a deal was too good to be true. Trust itself became a commodity. Women formed small networks of exchange, preferring to trade within familiar circles. A neighbor known to be honest was worth more than any guarantee. Betrayal could mean confiscation, arrest, death. Women weighed risk constantly, balancing need against caution. They learned to read faces, tones, gestures. The wrong partner could destroy an entire household. In places like the Łódź ghetto, the economy became almost industrial in scale. Workshops sprang up under German supervision, producing goods for the war effort. Women worked long hours sewing uniforms, repairing equipment, sorting materials. Payment came in the form of slightly increased rations, barely enough to justify the labor. Still, women fought for these positions, because any advantage, however small, could mean survival. The labor was exhausting. Women sat for hours hunched over machines, the rhythmic clatter filling rooms thick with dust and sweat. Their hands cramped. Their backs ached. Breaks were rare. Supervision was strict. Sabotage was subtle. A misaligned seam. A weakened stitch. A tool allowed to dull. Resistance took place in millimeters, unnoticed but intentional. Beyond official labor, women created parallel systems that operated entirely outside German control. Informal childcare allowed mothers to work or trade. Communal cooking reduced waste. Shared housing redistributed space. These systems were fragile, constantly threatened by raids and informants, but they persisted because women understood that survival could not be achieved alone. Women also managed debt, a concept that took on new meaning inside the ghettos. Food was borrowed with promises repaid in labor or future goods. Trust extended across days and weeks, even when the future was uncertain. Some women kept mental ledgers of who owed what, tracking obligations with precision. These informal economies relied on memory and reputation, not paperwork. As resources dwindled, desperation intensified. Women faced choices that tested their sense of self. Should they trade away the last family photograph for food? Should they accept help from someone who demanded too much in return? Should they exploit a skill at the expense of their own health? These decisions left scars that no one could see. Children noticed the strain. They watched their mothers negotiate, barter, sacrifice. They learned that survival was transactional, that love sometimes meant giving up the last possession, that dignity could be bent without breaking. Women shielded them from the worst truths when possible, but the lessons were absorbed regardless. The economy of survival reshaped social hierarchies. Wealth from before the war meant little. Connections mattered more. Adaptability mattered most. Women who could think creatively, who could improvise, who could endure humiliation without surrendering purpose, often fared better than those who clung to old structures. Even illness became part of the economy. Care was exchanged for food. Nursing was offered in return for shelter. Women who had medical knowledge, however limited, became invaluable. They treated wounds, tended fevers, improvised remedies. Their services were repaid with whatever could be spared. Survival blurred professional boundaries until everyone did whatever they could. As the ghettos aged, the economy grew harsher. Resources thinned. Opportunities narrowed. Women spent more time searching for ways to trade and less time resting. Fatigue accumulated. Bodies weakened. The margin for error shrank to nothing. One failed exchange could mean starvation. German authorities observed these informal economies with suspicion and contempt. Raids targeted markets. Goods were confiscated. Punishments were imposed. Women adapted again, shifting locations, changing signals, dispersing activity. The economy survived because it had to, because without it, death would accelerate. Despite everything, women continued to create moments of generosity. A shared meal, an unreturned favor, an act of kindness that made no economic sense. These moments mattered. They preserved humanity in a system designed to erase it. Women understood that survival was not only physical. It was moral, psychological, communal. As months passed, the economy of survival became more fragile, more desperate. The balance women maintained grew harder to sustain. Rumors spread of upcoming changes, of tighter controls, of mass actions that would render all trade meaningless. Women listened carefully, adjusting plans, conserving resources, preparing for disruptions they could not fully imagine. They sensed that the economy they had built, this intricate web of barter, labor, and ingenuity, was approaching a breaking point. Hunger had been weaponized. Smuggling had been resisted. Trade had sustained life against all odds. But now, something larger was moving into place, something that threatened to make survival itself obsolete. And as women counted their remaining goods, calculated their dwindling options, and prepared for the next exchange, they felt the ground shift once more, knowing that the rules they had learned might soon no longer apply at all. Chapter 6: Kitchens, Orphanages, and Quiet Mercy. The first kitchen did not look like a place of rescue. It was a room with cracked walls and a single pot blackened by years of use. Its bottom warped from too many fires fed by too little fuel. The air smelled of boiled roots and damp clothing. Women moved through it quietly, their steps careful, their voices low, as if sound itself could draw danger. And yet, in that room, something extraordinary was happening. Hunger had not been defeated, but it had been slowed. Life, briefly, had been given space to breathe. As starvation deepened, women understood what official systems would not provide. If families were to survive, food had to be pooled, care had to be shared, children had to be watched when parents could not. And so, without permission and often without records, women created institutions out of nothing. Kitchens appeared in basements, in abandoned shops, in courtyards shielded from view. Orphan care emerged in rooms meant for storage. Mercy took shape wherever women could make it fit. Soup kitchens were often the first to form. Women who could no longer feed their own families alone realized that collective effort could stretch resources just enough to matter. A handful of potatoes, some grain, scraps of vegetables salvaged from markets, or smuggling runs. When combined, they became something greater than their parts. The soup was thin. Everyone knew that. But it was warm. It was predictable. It gave people something to line up for, something to count on, something to anchor their day. Women volunteered to run these kitchens despite being just as hungry as those they served. They stood over steaming pots for hours, stirring slowly to prevent burning, tasting carefully to adjust seasoning that barely existed. Steam rose and clung to their hair, their skin slick with sweat even in winter. The work was exhausting, but it brought structure to chaos. Schedules were established, portions measured, fairness enforced with quiet authority. Women became administrators, logisticians, and caretakers all at once. Children gathered at these kitchens first. Their faces were drawn, their bodies too thin, their eyes watchful. Women knelt to their level, spoke gently, made jokes where they could. A bowl of soup placed into a child's hands was more than food. It was reassurance. It said, "Someone sees you. Someone remembers that you are here." Mothers watched from the edges, relief and shame tangled together, grateful that their children were eating, ashamed that they could not provide it alone. As hunger claimed parents with terrifying speed, orphanage spread through the ghettos like a second plague. Children appeared alone in doorways, sitting silently on steps, wandering streets with no destination. Women noticed them immediately. They always did. A child without an adult stood out in a place where every adult was already overwhelmed. Women took them in temporarily at first. One night, one meal, one blanket, then another, and another. Soon, rooms filled with children who did not belong to anyone and belonged to everyone. Orphan care inside the ghettos was improvised, fragile, and essential. Women converted rooms into sleeping areas, lining floors with straw or rags. They assigned older children to watch younger ones. They organized washing schedules, rudimentary lessons, quiet games to keep noise down. There were no resources to spare, but there was determination. Women understood that children without care were unlikely to survive, and that allowing them to vanish would mean surrendering the future entirely. Some women had experience. Former teachers, nurses, social workers. Others learned on the job, guided by instinct and necessity. They treated lice infestations, cleaned wounds, managed fevers with damp cloths, and whispered prayers. They memorized each child's name, each small preference, each fear. In a world designed to reduce people to numbers, women insisted on individuality. These efforts were not invisible to German authorities. They were tolerated only as long as they served German interests by maintaining order and productivity. When kitchens fed too many people, when orphan homes grew too large, scrutiny followed. Women learned how to navigate this danger. They kept operations modest in appearance, dispersed across multiple locations. They avoided drawing attention. Mercy became something practiced quietly, strategically, always under threat. Information flowed through these spaces as well. Kitchens and care centers became hubs of news, rumor, warning. Women exchanged updates while stirring pots or folding blankets. Who had been taken? Which streets were unsafe? Where raids had occurred? Knowledge traveled along the same lines as food and care, binding communities together, even as fear tried to tear them apart. In the Warsaw Ghetto, documentation became another form of quiet resistance tied closely to these networks of care. Women connected to the underground archive known as Oyneg passed through kitchens and orphan homes, collecting testimony, observing conditions, recording the truth of daily life. Mercy and memory walked hand in hand. Feeding the living and preserving the record of how they lived were seen as inseparable acts. Women also understood that mercy extended beyond food. Emotional survival mattered too. Children who had lost parents needed more than calories. They needed comfort, routine, a sense that the world had not ended completely. Women told stories at night, voices soft, tales drawn from memory, or invented on the spot. They celebrated birthdays with words instead of gifts. They marked holidays quietly, lighting candles shielded by cupped hands, insisting on tradition even when everything else had been stripped away. For mothers still caring for their own children, these communal efforts were lifelines. They allowed women to work, to trade, to smuggle, knowing their children were watched over. Trust deepened between women who shared responsibility. They became co-mothers, sharing grief, exhaustion, and determination. In these relationships, women found strength they did not know they possessed. Illness complicated everything. Kitchens became triage centers when epidemics swept through overcrowded districts. Women isolated the sick as best they could, though space was limited and resources scarce. They washed bedding endlessly, their hands cracked and bleeding from cold water and harsh soap substitutes. They wore makeshift masks, torn cloth tied over mouths, understanding the danger, even without medical training. When someone died, women prepared the body with care, maintaining dignity even in death. Mercy also extended outward, beyond the immediate community. Women organized aid for those completely destitute, for the elderly living alone, for the disabled who could not stand in lines. Food was delivered discreetly. Blankets were shared. These acts carried immense risk. Being caught providing unauthorized assistance could result in punishment or worse. Women calculated the danger and acted anyway. The psychological toll of constant giving was immense. Women drained themselves emotionally and physically, often neglecting their own needs entirely. Burnout was common, though it was not called that then. Women collapsed from exhaustion, fell ill, lost weight rapidly. Others stepped in to replace them. The work continued because it had to. There were no replacements waiting in reserve. Everyone was already stretched to the limit. Children witnessed this mercy and absorbed its lessons. They saw women share when they had little, protect when they were afraid, persist when logic suggested surrender. These observations shaped them deeply. In a place designed to teach cruelty, women taught care instead, not as an abstract value, but as daily practice. German policies grew harsher over time. Resources were cut further. Surveillance increased. Kitchens were shut down, then reopened elsewhere. Orphan homes were dispersed, then reassembled. Women adapted constantly, reshaping their efforts to survive new restrictions. Each closure felt like a personal blow, but also a challenge. If one door closed, another would be found. Despite everything, there were moments of quiet triumph. A child who gained weight, a fever that broke, a group that made it through winter together. Women held on to these moments fiercely. They shared them in whispers, allowed themselves brief smiles. These were not victories in the conventional sense. They did not change the course of the war, but they mattered deeply to those who lived them. As deportations loomed and rumors intensified, women sensed that their work was becoming even more urgent. Feeding someone today might be the last kindness they would ever receive. Caring for a child now might be the only stability they would ever know. Mercy took on a new weight, sharpened by the knowledge that time was running out. And yet, women did not stop. They continued to stir pots, wash blankets, soothe frightened children, record testimonies, and share what little they had. They did so not because they believed it would save everyone, but because it affirmed something essential, that even here, even now, humanity had not been completely extinguished. As the kitchens steamed and the orphan rooms filled with whispered lullabies, women felt the pressure building outside their fragile sanctuaries. The walls had held. Hunger had been resisted. Care had been organized. But beyond the reach of soup and shelter, something far more final was approaching, and the mercy women offered would soon be tested against forces it might not be able to withstand. Chapter 7. Teaching in Secret. The first lesson began without a classroom, without a bell, without permission. It began with a woman tearing a page from an old book and smoothing it flat on a table already crowded with bowls and rags. A child leaned in, eyes wide, as if the paper itself might vanish. Outside, boots passed in the street. Inside, a whisper carried letters from mouth to ear, fragile as breath. Teaching had become illegal, but forgetting was far more dangerous. From the moment the ghettos were sealed, education was marked for extinction. Schools were closed. Teachers were dismissed or arrested. Books were confiscated. The occupiers understood something essential. To starve the body was effective, but to starve the mind was permanent. Women recognized this instantly. They had watched their children grow quiet with hunger, watched curiosity dim under fear, and they refused to let the last light go out. If survival was to mean more than breathing, knowledge had to be preserved. Mothers became teachers overnight, often without preparation, often without confidence. Some had once taught in proper classrooms. Others had never imagined standing in front of a lesson. It did not matter. What mattered was that children needed structure, language, and meaning in a world determined to strip them away. Lessons took place wherever silence could be found. Kitchens before dawn, stairwells at midday, cellars at night, when curfews emptied the streets. Women taught reading with scraps of newspaper scavenged from trash piles, the ink smudged and the edges torn. They taught writing by scratching letters into dust, into ash, into condensation on windows. When paper could not be spared, children memorized passages aloud, committing them to memory like contraband. Knowledge became something carried inside the body, impossible to confiscate. Mathematics was taught through ration calculations and barter exchanges. History was told as stories, whispered carefully so as not to attract attention. Geography survived through memory alone, women tracing maps in the air with their fingers, describing places their children might never see. Science was simplified to observation. How cold settled into bones, how hunger changed the body, how disease spread when water ran low. Education adapted to reality without surrendering depth. The danger was constant. If caught, women faced arrest, deportation, execution. Children were punished as well, sometimes publicly, as warnings to others. Women learned how to teach without appearing to teach. A lesson became a game. A story became a question. Counting became sorting rags or stones. Learning was disguised as play, as chores, as idle conversation. The line between education and survival blurred until they became inseparable. In overcrowded apartments, women organized rotating lessons to reduce risk. Small groups met briefly, then dispersed. Children were taught to listen for specific sounds. Boots on stone, shouted commands, sudden silence. At the first warning, books were hidden, papers burned, lessons dissolved into ordinary domestic scenes. Women practiced these transitions until they were instinctive, their hearts pounding even as their faces remained calm. Education was not only about academics. Women understood that children needed emotional instruction as well. They taught resilience through stories of endurance, of ancestors who had survived persecution before. They taught ethics quietly, insisting on kindness even when cruelty surrounded them. They taught children how to control fear, how to remain still, how to observe without staring, how to remember names and faces in case separation came. Teenagers posed particular challenges. Too old for childish games, too young to be safe from labor or arrest, they hovered in dangerous territory. Women tailored lessons to them, teaching skills that might help them survive. Basic first aid, sewing, negotiation, languages. Knowledge became armor. Each new skill was a potential lifeline. In the Warsaw Ghetto, clandestine education reached remarkable scale. Entire networks of secret schools operated beneath the surface of daily life, coordinated largely by women who understood logistics as well as pedagogy. Schedules were memorized, not written. Locations shifted constantly. Teachers carried no incriminating materials. Students were sworn to silence not through fear alone, but through shared purpose. Women also taught culture, understanding that identity was under direct assault. Songs were passed down softly, melodies altered to avoid recognition. Poems were memorized line by line. Religious traditions were explained even when rituals could not be fully observed. Mothers describe holidays as they once were, painting pictures with words so children could imagine a world beyond walls. Children responded with fierce concentration. Hunger sharpened attention. Danger intensified memory. Many learned faster than they ever had before, driven by a sense that this knowledge mattered more now than ever. Women noticed this and adjusted, pushing gently, encouraging curiosity, celebrating small victories quietly. A child who read a sentence fluently was praised with a smile, a squeeze of the hand, a whispered word of pride. The physical environment shaped every lesson. Cold made hands stiff, turning writing into an exercise in endurance. Poor light strained eyes, forcing lessons to be short and precise. Noise carried too easily through thin walls, requiring constant vigilance. Women taught with one ear, always listening for danger, their voices modulated to blend with the background sounds of ghetto life. Illness disrupted everything. Fever swept through groups, forcing cancellations and relocations. Women adapted again, teaching from bedsides when necessary, turning care into instruction. They explained illness to children without frightening them, teaching hygiene as both science and survival tactic. Knowledge became a tool for resistance against disease as much as against ignorance. Not all parents supported secret education. Some fear the risk more than the loss. Women navigated these disagreements carefully, respecting fear while advocating for learning. They explained that education was not defiance for its own sake, but preparation. That children who learned to think, adapt, and remember might stand a better chance in whatever future awaited them. As deportations began to whisper through the ghettos, education took on new urgency. Women taught children how to memorize addresses, names, instructions in case of separation. They drilled them on how to answer questions without revealing too much. Lessons became survival briefings, disguised as ordinary schooling. Every piece of knowledge carried potential, life-saving value. Women also documented what they taught. Some kept hidden notes, recording lesson plans, student progress, observations about children's health and morale. Others relied entirely on memory, fearing that written evidence could endanger everyone. Teaching left no visible trace, but its impact was profound, shaping minds even as bodies weakened. The emotional bond between teachers and students deepened quickly. Women who taught became anchors, sources of stability in an unstable world. Children clung to them, sought them out, trusted them. This bond was both a gift and a burden. When children disappeared, were deported, or died, teachers grieved deeply, often without time or space to process loss. They returned to teaching anyway, because stopping felt like surrender. German crackdowns intensified periodically, targeting any sign of organized activity. Schools were suspected, searched for, disrupted. Women responded by fragmenting further, teaching in even smaller units, even more quietly. Education survived not through strength, but through flexibility. It bent without breaking. Despite the danger, moments of joy emerged. A child solved a problem. Another recited a poem from memory. Laughter escaped during a game, disguised as a lesson. Women allowed themselves brief smiles, knowing these moments were precious and fleeting. Joy itself became an act of defiance. Education also fostered resistance of a different kind. Children learned to question, to analyze, to understand the system that oppressed them. Women guided this carefully, mindful of danger, but determined that children would not internalize their dehumanization. They taught that what was happening was not normal, not deserved, not permanent. Even if survival was uncertain, truth had to survive. As months passed, the population of children thinned. Deportations, illness, starvation took their toll. Class sizes shrank. Women adjusted, focusing more intensely on those who remained. Teaching became more intimate, more urgent. Each lesson felt like it might be the last. And yet, even as the ghettos emptied, education persisted. Women taught until there were no students left, then taught again when new children appeared. They taught because it was who they were now. Caregivers, protectors, bearers of memory. As rumors of mass deportations hardened into reality, women sensed that the kind of education they could provide was about to change again. Soon, children would need to know not just how to read or count, but how to survive separation, transport, and the unknown. Teaching in secret had kept minds alive behind the walls. What came next would test whether knowledge alone could protect bodies when the walls themselves began to disappear. Chapter 8. Women under forced labor. The summons arrived without warning, folded into the daily noise of ghetto life like another inevitable blow. A posted notice, a shouted order, a list read aloud in a courtyard where people stood packed shoulder to shoulder, breath fogging the air. Women listened as names were called, their own hearts thudding so loudly they could barely hear the rest. Forced labor was no longer something that happened mostly to men. Now, women were being pulled directly into the machinery of exploitation, their bodies drafted for work designed to drain what little strength they had left. At first, many believed labor might mean survival. Work meant rations. Work meant protection, however thin. Women told themselves that sewing uniforms or sorting materials was preferable to starvation at home. Some even felt a flicker of relief at being assigned, because assignment meant postponement. Postponement of deportation, postponement of disappearance, postponement of the unknown. But this relief was fragile and short-lived. Workdays began before dawn. Women rose from floors or crowded beds, pulling on clothes still damp from the night air, tying scarves tightly to cover thinning hair. They kissed children goodbye with an intensity that felt excessive, because no goodbye could be trusted anymore. Streets filled with lines of women moving toward workshops and factories, their steps uneven, their faces set. Guards shouted. Rifles were raised casually. The smell of fear mixed with coal smoke and unwashed bodies. Inside the labor sites, the air was thick with dust and noise. Machines rattled endlessly, their rhythm unforgiving. Women were assigned to tasks based not on skill, but on immediate utility. Sewing, knitting, sorting confiscated belongings, repairing boots for soldiers who would never see their faces. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and deliberately paced to extract maximum effort with minimal sustenance. Women's hands became raw quickly. Needles pierced skin, thread cut into fingers already cracked from cold and hunger. Blood stained fabric, wiped away hastily for fear of punishment. There was no room for error. Supervisors watched closely, ready to strike, ready to report, ready to punish. A mistake could mean beating. Too many mistakes could mean removal, and removal meant something far worse than unemployment. Rations tied to labor were barely enough to justify the effort. A few extra grams of bread, a ladle of soup slightly thicker than before. Women calculated constantly whether the calories gained outweighed the energy spent. Often they did not. Bodies weakened further under the strain. Some women collapsed at their stations, their legs giving way without warning. Others fainted quietly, slumping forward until someone noticed or did not. Despite this, women pushed themselves beyond their limits. They worked not only for themselves, but for those waiting at home. A working woman might receive slightly more food, which could then be shared with children or elders. Labor became another form of sacrifice, another way women shielded families from total collapse. Exhaustion was accepted as the price of keeping others alive. In places like the Łódź ghetto, forced labor became the defining feature of daily existence. Entire neighborhoods were reorganized around production quotas. Women made up a massive portion of the workforce, their labor feeding the German war machine, even as it destroyed them. They learned factory discipline quickly because survival demanded it. They learned when to slow down, when to speed up, when to appear compliant, when to disappear into the crowd. Sabotage emerged quietly, almost instinctively. A stitch weakened just enough to fail later. A boot sole attached imperfectly. Materials miscounted. These acts were small, careful, designed to avoid detection. Women understood the limits. Open resistance meant death. Subtle resistance meant dignity. It also meant risk, and women carried that risk silently. The emotional toll of forced labor was immense. Women worked alongside the spoils of destruction. Clothes taken from the dead, household items stolen from emptied homes, children's shoes sorted into piles. Each object told a story they were not allowed to acknowledge. Sorting these items required emotional numbness, a shutting down of empathy that haunted women long after shifts ended. At night, memories surfaced uninvited, heavy, and relentless. Sexual harassment and abuse were constant threats. Supervisors used power casually, cruelly. Women learned how to deflect attention, how to make themselves small, how to endure humiliation without reaction. Silence became armor. Resistance took the form of survival, not confrontation. Every day at work required women to navigate danger that had nothing to do with machines or quotas. When women returned home after shifts, their bodies barely functioned. Feet swollen, backs aching, hands trembling. And yet, work did not end. Meals had to be prepared, children tended, water fetched. Women collapsed in a sleep only to wake again hours later, their bodies screaming for rest that never came. Labor extended beyond the factory walls, unacknowledged and unpaid. Children watched their mothers leave and return changed. Quieter, thinner, more withdrawn. Women tried to shield them from the reality of labor, describing it as work like before the war, something ordinary. Children were not fooled. They saw the toll. They absorbed the fear. Mothers carried guilt alongside exhaustion, fearing that their children were learning lessons no child should have to learn. Some women were assigned to outdoor labor, clearing rubble, hauling materials, cleaning streets. Weather offered no mercy. Winter froze fingers to tools. Summer heat drained already depleted bodies. Guards shouted constantly, forcing speed where there was none left to give. Falls were common, injuries untreated. Women learned to ignore pain because acknowledging it changed nothing. Illness spread rapidly among laborers. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Cuts became infections. Fevers went unchecked. Women worked sick because absence meant punishment or removal. They hid symptoms, leaned on each other for support, shared scraps of medicine if they existed. Mutual care became another quiet system running parallel to forced labor. Despite everything, bonds formed among women who worked together. Shared glances, silent understanding. Small acts of kindness passed unnoticed by overseers. A woman slowing her pace to help another keep up. A piece of bread slipped into a pocket. These moments mattered deeply. They reminded women that they were not alone inside the machine. Labor also became a source of information. Women heard rumors from guards, from civilian workers, from other laborers moved between sites. News traveled back into the ghetto through exhausted bodies and whispered conversations. Women relayed what they heard carefully, filtering rumor from reality, preparing families for what might come next. As deportations intensified, labor assignments took on new meaning. Being selected for work sometimes meant temporary safety. Being deemed unfit meant immediate danger. Women had illnesses. They stood straighter during inspections. They pinched cheeks to add color. Survival required performance. Bodies became evidence, evaluated constantly. Forced labor reshaped identity. Women who had once defined themselves by family roles now measure their worth in output and endurance. Some internalized this transformation with bitterness. Others resisted it mentally, clinging to inner lives untouched by quotas. At night, they remembered who they had been, who they still were beneath the exhaustion. German authorities framed labor as opportunity, as contribution, as order. Women understood it as extraction. Every hour worked fed a system that sought their destruction. This knowledge burned quietly, fueling both despair and defiance. Women continued not because they believed in the work, but because survival demanded it. As time passed, the demands increased. Longer hours, higher quotas, less food. The margin for survival narrowed further. Women felt their bodies failing, their strength eroding faster than it could be replenished. Still, they showed up. Still, they worked. Because not working meant disappearance, and working at least delayed it. Toward the end, rumors hardened into certainty. Labor would not save everyone. Workshops were being liquidated. Workers deported despite productivity. The illusion of protection shattered. Women sensed the shift immediately. The atmosphere changed. Guards grew harsher. Inspections more frequent. The future contracted suddenly. As women lined up for another day of work, tools in hand, stomachs hollow, they understood that forced labor had bought time. But time alone could not stop what was coming. Hunger had weakened them. Smuggling had sustained them. Care had protected them. Education had preserved minds. Now, labor had exhausted bodies to the brink. and beyond the factory walls, something waited that would not be delayed by productivity, obedience, or endurance at all. Chapter 9. Bodies Under Control. The first warning was never spoken aloud. It lived in glances, in silences, in the way women shifted their posture when certain men entered a room. It lived in the instinctive tightening of shoulders, the way breath caught just slightly when boots stopped too close. Violence in the ghettos did not always announce itself with shouting or gunfire. Often, it arrived quietly, wrapped in authority, normalized by fear, enforced by power that could not be questioned. From the earliest days of confinement, women understood that their bodies were no longer their own. Control extended beyond movement, beyond labor, beyond hunger. It reached into the most intimate spaces of existence. German guards, police auxiliaries, collaborators, and even ghetto officials wielded power over women in ways that blurred the line between survival and violation. And the system was designed so that silence followed. Sexual violence was not an accident of occupation. It was an extension of domination. Women learned quickly which routes were unsafe, which stairwells to avoid, which work assignments carried unspoken risks. Mothers warned daughters without naming the danger directly. Words were often unnecessary. Fear did the teaching. For young women, adolescence became a liability. Bodies that mature became targets. Girls bound their chests, wore oversized clothing, smeared dirt on their faces to appear sick or undesirable. They lowered their eyes, hunched their shoulders, tried to disappear into crowds. Mothers watched helplessly, knowing that no disguise was foolproof, knowing that attention could not always be avoided. Women assigned to forced labor faced constant exposure. Supervisors lingered. Hands brushed deliberately. Comments were made in tones meant to humiliate and threaten at once. Resistance carried consequences no one could afford. Refusal could mean beatings, dismissal, deportation. Compliance carried its own unbearable cost. Many women learned to endure in silence, detaching from their bodies as a means of survival. Inside overcrowded apartments, privacy vanished. This created new vulnerabilities. Women shared sleeping spaces with strangers, sometimes with men they did not know or trust. Nights were tense, sleep light, and fractured. Mothers stayed awake longer than their children, listening, watching, prepared to intervene, if necessary, despite knowing intervention could escalate danger. Protection became another invisible labor women carried alone. Some violence was overt. Rapes occurred during raids, inspections, and deportations. They happened in stairwells, courtyards, workplaces, guard posts. They were often accompanied by threats of death, of exposure, of retaliation against family members. Women endured knowing that survival depended on compliance, knowing that resistance might condemn not just themselves, but those they loved. Other violence was transactional, disguised as opportunity. Food in exchange for access. Protection in exchange for silence. Work assignments in exchange for submission. These offers were never made openly. They were implied, communicated through looks and gestures, enforced by the imbalance of power. Women faced impossible choices, forced to weigh bodily autonomy against starvation, deportation, or execution. The shame was immediate and crushing, imposed from all sides. Women blamed themselves, even as they knew they should not. Communities whispered. Victims feared judgment as much as punishment. Silence became survival. Many women never spoke of what happened. Not during the war, not after. Trauma was carried inward, shaping lives in ways few could articulate. Pregnancy resulting from assault introduced new layers of terror. Inside the ghettos, pregnancy was already dangerous. Pregnancy marked a woman as vulnerable, as unproductive, as disposable. Women who became pregnant through violence faced desperate decisions. Some sought unsafe abortions, risking death. Others carried pregnancies in secret, hoping to hide their condition long enough to survive. Each path carried unimaginable risk. Mothers who suspected their daughters had been violated often said nothing. They offered care instead. extra food if it could be found, silence when questions arose, protection through proximity. Love became practical rather than verbal. Women learned to recognize trauma without naming it, responding with gestures rather than words. In the Warsaw Ghetto, social workers and doctors encountered these realities daily. Women came seeking treatment for injuries they could not explain, for illnesses tied to abuse, for despair so deep it manifested physically. Medical professionals, many of them women themselves, treated what they could and documented nothing that might endanger their patients. Care was offered quietly, compassionately, without interrogation. Sexual violence also fractured trust among women themselves. Competition for safety, resources, and protection sometimes bred resentment. Women judged each other harshly, repeating the language of shame imposed by the oppressors. Others resisted this impulse, offering solidarity instead. Support networks formed discreetly, women sharing strategies for avoidance, warning each other about dangerous individuals. The psychological toll was immense. Women learned to live with constant vigilance, never fully relaxed, never entirely safe. Trauma layered on top of hunger, exhaustion, grief. Some women dissociated completely, functioning outwardly while numb inside. Others broke down privately, collapsing when no one could see. Mental illness increased, though it was rarely recognized as such. Survival left little room for reflection. Children sensed the tension, even when they did not understand its source. They noticed changes in their mother's behavior, their guardedness, their fear of certain places or people. Women tried to shield them, but fear seeped through nonetheless. Childhood became saturated with unspoken dread. Despite everything, women continued to resist in the ways available to them. They avoided isolation when possible. They traveled in groups. They shared information relentlessly. They used their collective presence as protection, knowing predators preferred victims without witnesses. Solidarity became a shield, however imperfect. Some women fought back physically when they could. These moments were rare and dangerous, but they happened. Scratching, biting, screaming. Acts of defiance that carried severe consequences but affirmed something essential. That submission was not consent, even when silence was forced. As deportations intensified, sexual violence spiked. Chaos created opportunity. Guards exploited confusion. Women were assaulted during roundups, searches, transports. The breakdown of order removed even the pretense of restraint. Women understood that what little protection existed was disappearing fast. And yet, even in these moments, women protected each other. Mothers shielded daughters with their bodies. Women exchanged places and lines to save someone younger. They clung together in transports, hands gripping tightly, forming human barriers where none should have been needed. After assaults, life did not pause. Hunger continued. Labor resumed. Care obligations remained. Women were expected to carry on as if nothing had happened. And many did, because stopping meant surrender. Survival demanded endurance beyond what should ever be asked of a human being. The violence inflicted on women's bodies was meant to break communities from the inside, to erode trust, to destroy identity. In many ways, it succeeded. Trauma lingered long after liberation. Silence followed survivors into peacetime, but did not erase everything. Because even under this most intimate form of domination, women retained agency in fragments. In how they cared for each other, in how they protected children, in how they refused to internalize the lie that what happened defined their worth. As the ghettos moved closer to liquidation, women sensed that bodily danger was escalating alongside existential threat. Control was tightening. Boundaries were collapsing. What had once been hidden was becoming overt. And as they prepared for whatever came next, transport, separation, annihilation, women carried wounds no one could see, knowing that survival would soon require them to endure even greater violations of body, memory, and self. Chapter 10. Choosing Who Lives. The moment always arrived without ceremony. No trumpet, no warning that could truly prepare anyone. Just a notice posted crookedly on a wall, or a shouted command echoing through a courtyard already heavy with fear. A list, a line, a selection. Women felt it before they understood it, a cold pressure spreading through the chest, because this time survival was no longer something they could negotiate with food, labor, or silence. This time, survival demanded choice. At first, the selections were framed as administrative. Registration updates, work assignments, resettlement, words drained of meaning through repetition. Women had learned to distrust language. They watched instead. They watched who was taken, who was returned, who disappeared without explanation. Patterns emerged quickly, and they were merciless. The sick, the elderly, the very young. Mothers understood the truth long before it was spoken aloud. Not everyone would be allowed to remain. Selection days transformed the ghettos. Streets emptied, then filled suddenly with bodies pressed together, people clutching documents that no longer mattered. Women dressed their children carefully, smoothing hair, wiping faces, adding layers to make thin bodies appear stronger. They practiced calm expressions in cracked mirrors, teaching children how to stand straight, how to answer questions briefly, how not to cry no matter what they felt. Mothers rehearsed instructions in whispers the night before. If I am taken and you are not, go to this address. If we are separated, remember your name. Remember who you are. Children listen with wide eyes, absorbing fear without fully understanding it. Women kissed foreheads longer than usual, memorizing the weight of small bodies, the curve of familiar faces, terrified that memory might be all that remained. The selections themselves were brutally efficient. Lines formed under watchful eyes. Guards paced slowly, pointing left or right with casual gestures that carried the weight of life and death. Women learned to read these gestures, to anticipate decisions, to make last-second adjustments. A child pulled closer. A grandmother nudged backward. A cough suppressed at any cost. Sometimes women were forced to choose directly. A guard would demand one child be handed over to spare another. A sick relative identified as expendable. A quota met only if someone was sacrificed. These moments shattered women from the inside. There was no right choice, only unbearable ones. Some women refused and were taken with their families. Others complied and carried the guilt forever. Survival came wrapped in moral injury that never healed. Inside crowded apartments, these decisions replayed endlessly. Women lay awake at night, listening to children breathe, calculating scenarios no one should ever have to imagine. Who could run fastest? Who could hide best? Who might survive outside the ghetto if sent away? Mothers became strategists, weighing lives against probability, love against logic, knowing that any decision might be the wrong one. In places like the Warsaw Ghetto, selections intensified as deportations accelerated. Entire streets were cleared in hours. Women watched neighbors vanish, apartments sealed, belongings looted. The scale of loss was overwhelming, but women focused on the immediate. The next selection, the next knock, the next decision that might come before dawn. Some women made the most agonizing choice of all, sending children away alone. Smugglers, underground networks, non-Jewish contacts, orphan rescue efforts. These options were whispered about cautiously, surrounded by rumor and risk. Sending a child out meant relinquishing control completely, trusting strangers with what mattered most. Women weighed this against the certainty of death inside the ghetto and chose with trembling resolve. Goodbyes in these moments were quiet, deliberately ordinary. A child was told they were going on an errand, a visit, an adventure. Mothers smiled through tears, straightened collars, pressed bread into small hands. They watched from windows as children disappeared into crowds, their bodies screaming to run after them. Many never saw them again. Some children survived. Many did not. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. For women who kept their children with them, protection became physical. Mothers positioned themselves between children and guards, absorbing blows, deflecting attention. They learned how to argue convincingly, how to plead without appearing defiant, how to collapse dramatically to create distraction. Bodies became shields. Pain was accepted without question. Selections also targeted women themselves. Pregnant women. Women deemed unfit for labor. Women who appeared too weak. Women hid pregnancies with layered clothing and rigid posture. They avoided medical checks. They learned how to appear functional even when their bodies were failing. Survival demanded performance, and women performed relentlessly. The psychological impact of constant selection was devastating. Women lived in a state of permanent anticipation, nerves frayed beyond repair. Joy felt dangerous. Attachment felt reckless. And yet, women continued to love fiercely because withholding love felt like another kind of death. They clung to children, to parents, to each other, even knowing those bonds could be ripped away at any moment. Children learned quickly what selection meant. They stopped asking questions. They watched adults carefully, mimicking behavior that seemed to protect. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent. Childhood became tactical. Mothers mourned this loss even as they encouraged it, because innocence offered no protection. After selections, ghettos felt eerily quiet. Those who remained moved through streets strewn with abandoned belongings. Shoes, toys, clothing. Women collected what they could, redistributing resources with grim efficiency. Survival demanded that nothing be wasted, not even the remnants of vanished lives. This practical response coexisted with profound grief, the two inseparable. Some women recorded these moments secretly. Names, dates, numbers. They wrote because they feared memory itself might be erased. Others could not bear to document such pain and relied on their minds alone. Both choices were acts of resistance against oblivion. Women also supported each other through shared grief. There were no formal mourning rituals left, no space for public lament. Instead, women gathered quietly, holding hands, exchanging stories, crying in brief, controlled bursts before returning to the demands of survival. Grief became communal, compressed, managed. As selections intensified, trust eroded further. Informants proliferated. False accusations increased. Women learned to guard information tightly, sharing plans only with those they trusted completely. Survival strategies grew more individual, more desperate. The social fabric strained under relentless pressure. German authorities exploited this fragmentation deliberately. They forced impossible choices to break solidarity, to make victims complicit in the system that destroyed them. Women understood this even as they were trapped within it. They carried anger alongside guilt, recognizing the cruelty of a system that demanded moral collapse as proof of control. Despite everything, women continued to resist the logic of selection in small ways. They hid children in cupboards, attics, basements. They altered ages on documents. They swapped places in lines. They created confusion when possible, delaying processes, disrupting efficiency. These acts rarely changed outcomes on a large scale, but they mattered deeply to those involved. The aftermath of each selection reshaped the ghettos. Families were shattered. Households dissolved. Women took in surviving children, creating new units from fragments of old ones. Care expanded even as capacity shrank. Women refused to let children be entirely alone, even when doing so stretched resources dangerously thin. As deportations reached their peak, women sensed that selections were no longer about managing populations. They were about erasure. The goal was no longer control, but removal. This realization hit with crushing force. The strategies that had worked before, labor, trade, compliance, were losing effectiveness. And still, women prepared for the next day. They dressed children carefully. They memorized instructions again. They planned routes, rehearsed lies, practiced calm. Choosing who lives was not something women ever accepted. It was something forced upon them, again and again, until the weight of it became almost unbearable. As the ghettos emptied and the future narrowed to a single terrifying path, women understood that the choices they were making now would echo far beyond the walls. Some choices would save lives. Others would haunt survivors forever. And with each selection, the space for choice itself grew smaller, tightening like a vice, preparing women for the moment when choice would disappear entirely. Chapter 11. When the ghettos began to empty. At first, the silence felt like relief. Streets that had once pulsed with desperate movement suddenly stood still. Lines disappeared. Markets thinned. Courtyards echoed in unfamiliar ways. Women noticed it immediately. The way sound traveled farther now. The way footsteps no longer blended into a constant murmur. The ghettos were changing again, and this time the change did not feel like adaptation. It felt like erasure. The deportations had begun as selections, as lists, as removals that could almost be rationalized if one tried hard enough. But now the scale shifted. Entire buildings were cleared in a single morning. Entire streets were marched toward collection points under armed guard. Women watched from behind curtains as neighbors vanished, their belongings tossed into piles or looted on the spot. The ghettos were not being managed anymore. They were being dismantled. For women, this phase brought a new kind of terror. Survival had always been precarious, but now it was also finite. Time felt compressed. Every hour waited with urgency. Women woke, each morning unsure whether their home would still exist by nightfall. They packed and unpacked repeatedly, preparing bundles that might never be carried anywhere, because readiness itself felt like the only control left. Children sensed the shift immediately. The adults' fear was sharper now, less disguised. Women tried to maintain routines, meals, lessons, chores, but everything felt provisional. Every embrace lingered longer. Every instruction was delivered with greater care. Mothers memorized their children's faces with a desperation that bordered on panic, aware that memory might soon replace presence. As ghettos emptied, women were forced into a cruel paradox. Fewer people meant slightly more space, slightly less competition for resources. For a brief moment, survival seemed marginally easier for those who remained. But this advantage carried a terrible price. It meant others had already been taken. It meant the process was working. Women understood that any temporary relief was borrowed time, paid for with lives. Rumors hardened into certainty. Trains were waiting. Destinations were not labor camps as promised. People did not return. Women pieced together the truth through fragments, whispered accounts, missing names, the finality in guards' behavior. The ghettos were not transitions anymore. They were holding pens. Women began to plan not just for survival, but for disappearance. They hid valuables in walls and floors, knowing they might never retrieve them. They left notes behind furniture, under loose boards, hoping someone might one day find proof that they had existed. Some wrote letters they could not send, sealing them in jars, entrusting memory to chance. Families fractured under the pressure. Some men urged women to flee if they could, to save the children at any cost. Some women refused, unwilling to abandon anyone. Arguments erupted behind closed doors, voices hushed but fierce. Every decision carried irreversible consequences. Women bore the weight of these decisions heavily, knowing that hesitation could be fatal, but certainty was impossible. Women who had sent children away earlier lived with agonizing uncertainty. Had they chosen correctly? Had their child survived? Was separation mercy or cruelty? Those who had kept children close now questioned everything, haunted by the fear that love itself might doom them. No choice felt safe anymore. As buildings emptied, women scavenged what remained, redistributing clothing, bedding, tools. Survival instincts took over with ruthless efficiency. Abandoned apartments were stripped bare within hours. Nothing could be wasted. Even in grief, women acted, because stopping meant succumbing to despair that could kill just as surely as hunger. The social fabric of the ghettos changed profoundly. Networks that had sustained life, kitchens, schools, workshops, collapsed as their members were taken. Women scrambled to rebuild them with whoever remained. Roles shifted constantly. Someone was always missing. Someone else stepped in. Adaptation became frantic rather than deliberate. In places like the Warsaw Ghetto, entire districts were reduced to ruins after mass deportations. Women walked through streets filled with debris and silence, stepping over shattered glass and abandoned toys. The scale of absence was overwhelming. Familiar faces were gone. Familiar sound were gone. Even familiar fear had changed shape. Women who survived early deportation waves found themselves marked. Survival became isolating. Guilt set in. Why me? Why not them? Women carried this question silently, fearing that speaking it aloud might invite judgment or punishment. Survival no longer felt like victory. It felt like postponement. As ghettos emptied, German control intensified. Remaining residents were concentrated into smaller areas, easier to monitor, easier to liquidate. Women noticed the tightening immediately. Movement was restricted further. Surveillance increased. The sense of being watched never faded. Every step felt measured. Every action potentially observed. Women adapted again, but adaptation now felt futile. The strategies that had once sustained life, smuggling, labor, compliance, were losing effectiveness. Guards no longer cared whether people worked. Productivity no longer protected. The illusion of usefulness shattered completely. Women felt the ground give way beneath every assumption they had relied on. Children reacted in different ways. Some became withdrawn, silent, conserving energy and emotion. Others grew restless, sensing danger without understanding it fully. Women struggled to comfort them, to explain what could not be explained. Words felt inadequate. Silence felt dishonest. Mothers walked this line constantly, trying to preserve trust while acknowledging fear. Women also faced increased violence during this phase. Raids became more brutal, searches more invasive, assaults more frequent. Chaos provided cover for cruelty. Women learned to expect nothing from authority except harm. They relied on each other instead, forming protective clusters wherever possible. As deportations accelerated, women began to hear new terms whispered with dread. Liquidation, final action, clearance. Language shifted again, becoming more overt, more final. Women understood that the ghettos themselves were nearing the end of their purpose. Whatever came next would not involve walls or ration cards or labor assignments. Some women sought escape desperately during this period. They bribed guards. They forged documents. They attempted to pass as non-Jewish. These efforts required resources, connections, and luck. Few succeeded. Those who did lived with the knowledge that escape meant leaving others behind. Survival came at the cost of separation that could never be repaired. Others chose to stay, believing that abandoning family was a greater betrayal than any risk. Mothers clung to children. Daughters refused to leave parents. Women defined loyalty in different ways, each shaped by love and fear in equal measure. There was no consensus, no shared moral ground left to stand on. As numbers dwindled, women noticed something else: the loss of witnesses. Fewer people meant fewer eyes to see, fewer voices to remember. This terrified them more than death itself. Oblivion felt worse. Women whispered stories more urgently now, repeating names, recounting events, insisting on memory, even as the community that held it dissolved. Some women took on the role of caretakers for the dying in these final days. Elderly people too weak to move. Sick people abandoned during deportations. Women cleaned them, fed them when possible, sat with them as they faded. These acts were not strategic. They did not increase survival odds. They were expressions of humanity that refused to be extinguished. The emotional exhaustion was profound. Women operated on instinct alone, their minds dulled by constant trauma. Sleep came in fragments. Nightmares blurred into waking hours. Still, women rose each morning and faced whatever came next, because stopping meant surrender. As ghettos emptied further, the outside world crept closer. Walls were torn down, boundaries blurred. Women glimpsed streets they had not seen in years, now strange and hostile. Freedom of movement returned only as a prelude to annihilation. The irony was not lost on anyone. The final days carried a heavy, almost unreal quality. Time stretched and contracted unpredictably. Some days were filled with frantic activity. Others passed in eerie calm. Women lived in a state of suspended anticipation, waiting for a knock that would end everything, knowing it could come at any moment. And when the knock did not come immediately, women did not relax. They prepared instead. They gathered children close. They hid what little they could. They whispered last instructions, last reassurances, last promises they could not keep. The ghettos were emptying, but women remained, standing at the edge of an unknown that felt darker than anything they had faced before. Hunger, labor, violence, selection, all had been survived, resisted, endured. Now, the structures themselves were collapsing, and as the walls that had once imprisoned them began to disappear, women understood with terrifying clarity that the disappearance of the ghettos did not mean liberation. It meant something far worse was about to begin. Chapter 12. The trains took everything. The morning the trains came, the air felt wrong. Women sensed it before the whistles, before the shouting, before the streets filled with movement that had only one direction. There was a heaviness to the silence, a pressure that settled into the chest and refused to lift. This was not another raid, not another selection meant to thin the population. This was something final, something vast enough to swallow entire worlds at once. Orders spread quickly, carried by guards, by ghetto police, by fear itself. Everyone was to report to assembly points. Immediately, with belongings limited to what could be carried by hand. Women moved on instinct. They grabbed bundles they had packed and unpacked countless times, hands shaking as they tied cloth around bread that might already be moldy, clothing that no longer fit anyone properly. Children were dressed in layers regardless of the weather, because no one knew where they were going or how long they would be gone. The streets filled with bodies moving in silence, broken only by crying children and shouted commands. Women held hands tightly, afraid that even a moment's separation would be permanent. The smell of fear was unmistakable: sweat, unwashed clothing, the sharp tang of panic carried on shallow breaths. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere else, a window slammed shut as someone realized hiding was no longer possible. At the assembly points, chaos took on structure. Lines formed under threat of violence. People were beaten into order. Women scanned faces frantically, counting children again and again, terrified that someone might be lost in the crowd. Mothers pressed children against their bodies, whispering instructions one last time. Stay quiet. Do not let go. Whatever happens, stay close. The trains waited beyond the ghetto boundaries, their dark shapes looming like promises no one wanted fulfilled. Cattle cars stood open, their interiors already foul from previous transports. The smell hit first: human waste, sweat, rot, despair embedded into wood. Women recoiled instinctively, then forced themselves forward when rifles pressed into backs and shoulders. Resistance was impossible. Hesitation was punished immediately. Loading began with brutal efficiency. Families were torn apart in seconds. A child pulled from a mother's arms. A woman shoved in one direction while her parents were sent another way. Screams rose and were silenced with blows. Women fought with everything they had, clinging, clawing, pleading. Sometimes it worked for a moment. Sometimes it did not. Often, it made things worse. Choices vanished completely, replaced by force so absolute it left no room for negotiation. Inside the cars, space disappeared instantly. Women were crushed together, bodies pressed so tightly that breathing became difficult. There was no room to sit, no room to lie down. Children were lifted onto shoulders just so they could inhale air above the press of bodies. The doors slammed shut with finality that echoed through bones. Darkness swallowed everything. As the train lurched into motion, panic surged. People screamed for water, for air, for mercy. Women tried to calm children, their voices hoarse, their hearts pounding wildly. The heat rose quickly. Bodies pressed closer as people sought stability. sweat-soaked clothing. The smell became unbearable. Women gagged silently, focusing on keeping children conscious, fanning faces with whatever scraps of fabric they had. Time dissolved inside the cars. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours into something unmeasurable. There was no way to know how far they had traveled or where they were going. Only that the train did not stop. Women rationed sips of water carefully, moistening children's lips, swallowing their own thirst. Some people collapsed. There was nowhere for them to fall except against others. Women held them upright as long as they could. Death arrived quietly at first. A child went limp. An elderly woman slid downward, her breathing shallow, then gone. Women noticed immediately. They always did. They tried to revive, to shake, to whisper names. When nothing worked, they closed eyes with trembling hands. Bodies were held upright because there was no space to lay them down. Death became another presence, pressed among the living. Mothers faced impossible decisions inside those cars. Should they give the last drop of water to a child who might already be dying, or save it for one who still had strength? Should they hold a fading body, or focus on those who could still be saved? Every choice carried guilt that would never fade. Survival became triage conducted in darkness, heat, and terror. Children cried until they could not cry anymore. Some fell silent from exhaustion. Others screamed until their voices gave out. Women sang softly to distract them, lullabies barely audible over the grinding of wheels. Songs from before the war, from kitchens and bedrooms that no longer existed. Music became a fragile thread holding sanity together. The lack of air became unbearable. People pounded on the walls, begging guards outside to open doors. Shots rang out occasionally, meant to silence desperation. Women shielded children from the sound as best they could, pressing heads against chests, whispering reassurances they did not believe themselves. Hope narrowed to the next breath. When the train finally stopped, it was abrupt. Bodies swayed and crashed into one another. For a moment, there was silence, stunned and unreal. Then the doors were wrenched open, flooding the car with light and cold air that burned lungs unaccustomed to it. Women gasped, coughing, blinking against brightness. Shots followed immediately. Orders barked in harsh tones. Dogs snarled. Guards waved rifles, forcing people out of the cars at speed. Women jumped down awkwardly, legs stiff, bodies numb. Some fell and were beaten to their feet. Children were yanked forward. The ground was unfamiliar, the surroundings stark, stripped of any resemblance to the world they knew. The smell here was different. Sharp, chemical. Smoke hung in the air, its source not immediately visible but unmistakable. Women noticed it instinctively, a wrongness that set nerves on fire. Some asked where they were. No one answered. Confusion was deliberate. Disorientation was part of the process. Almost immediately, the lines were formed. Men separated from women. Children torn from fathers, then sometimes from mothers. Women screamed, fought, collapsed. Guards showed no reaction. Selection happened again, faster now, cruder, more final. A gesture left, a gesture right. Women tried to hold families together, but hands were forced apart. Those deemed unfit, children, the elderly, the sick, were directed away. Women watched them disappear, a numb certainty settling in that this separation was not temporary. Some mothers refused to let go and were struck down. Others were dragged along screaming, arms reaching back toward children already gone from sight. Women who remained standing were marched forward. They glanced back constantly, desperate for one last glimpse of loved ones. Many never saw them again. The loss was so immediate, so absolute, that the mind struggled to comprehend it. Grief arrived later. For now, shock dominated. Belongings were stripped away. Bundles dropped. Shoes removed. Haircut. Identity erased step by step. Women felt exposed in ways that went beyond physical nakedness. Everything that had defined them, home, family, role, was being systematically removed. Resistance was impossible. Compliance was enforced through terror. Inside the camps, women were herded into barracks, their movements dictated, their bodies inspected, their humanity reduced to numbers. The journey had not ended at the train. It had only transformed. The ghetto, brutal as it had been, now felt distant, almost unreal. Survival would require adaptation all over again, under conditions even harsher. For those left behind during deportations, women who watched trains leave without them, the aftermath was its own nightmare. Empty streets, abandoned belongings, silence broken only by wind and distant sounds of destruction. Women scavenged what remained, moving through ghostly spaces where life had once crowded every corner. Survival felt hollow, unearned, temporary. Women who survived the trains carried the memory forever. The darkness, the heat, the deaths held upright among the living. These memories did not fade. They shaped every breath that followed. Trauma became a constant companion, shaping reactions, dreams, identities. The trains did more than transport bodies. They severed communities. They erased families. They transformed survival into something solitary, stripped of context and support. Women who had once lived surrounded by networks of care now faced a reality where those networks were annihilated in a single journey. As the ghettos emptied completely, the trains became the final link between one form of suffering and another. Women understood now that the ghettos had been only a prelude, a holding space designed to weaken, isolate, and prepare them for what followed. And as the echoes of departing trains faded into the distance, women carried with them the knowledge that everything they had fought to preserve, family, community, dignity, had been tested to its limits, and that survival from this point forward would demand strength beyond anything the ghettos had required. Chapter 13. Mothers without children. The absence was immediate and physical. Women felt it in their arms first, the unfamiliar lightness where weight had always been. They reached automatically, instinctively, for hands that were no longer there. In the barracks, on the platforms, in the streets emptied by deportation, the silence left behind by children was louder than any scream. It pressed in on the chest, stole breath, made standing upright feel impossible. Mothers learned, in that moment, that survival without their children was a different kind of suffering entirely. Some women lost their children during the chaos of the transports, hands torn apart by force, bodies separated by shouting and blows. Others watched their children led away in lines marked by age, by weakness, by arbitrary gestures of authority. Some mothers made the decision themselves, sending children away earlier in desperate hope. No matter how it happened, the result was the same. The role that had defined their every movement, every decision, every sacrifice was suddenly gone, leaving a void nothing could fill. In the camps and remnants of ghettos alike, women wandered through days that no longer had structure. There were still commands to follow, labor to perform, rules to obey, but the internal rhythm that had once governed life was shattered. Mothers had measured time by meals prepared, lessons taught, injuries tended, bedtime rituals enforced. Now, time stretched endlessly, unmarked by purpose. Morning arrived without reason. Night fell without relief. Grief was not allowed space. There were no funerals, no mourning rituals, no acknowledgement from the system that anything precious had been lost. Women were expected to function immediately, to stand in lines, to work, to comply. Tears were dangerous. Collapse invited punishment. And so grief turned inward, becoming something heavy and constant, carried silently through every hour. Some women clung to denial at first. They told themselves their children might still be alive somewhere else. Another camp, another transport, another barracks. This fragile hope was often the only thing keeping them upright. Women whispered children's names to themselves at night, repeating them like prayers, refusing to let them vanish entirely. Memory became an act of resistance. Others were forced into brutal clarity. They saw smoke. They smelled it. They understood. This knowledge did not arrive all at once. It crept in, piece by piece, until it could no longer be ignored. Women who reached this point often felt something inside them break completely. The world narrowed to endurance alone. Survival ceased to feel like a goal and became an obligation imposed by circumstance. Women who had no children of their own took on new roles, drawn instinctively to those who were grieving. They offered water, shared scraps of food, stood nearby without speaking. They learned that presence mattered more than words. In a place where language had been stripped of meaning, companionship was one of the last comforts left. Some mothers redirected their care outward as a way to survive. They tended to other women. They helped the sick. They shared knowledge, skills, strategies. Caregiving, once centered on children, expanded to encompass anyone who needed it. This was not a replacement. It was a coping mechanism. Love, denied its original focus, found new, fragile outlets. The loss of children also altered women's relationships with their own bodies. Bodies that had carried life now felt like sites of betrayal or failure. Some women experienced profound shame, even though they bore no responsibility for what had happened. Others felt rage toward their own survival, a sense that continuing to exist was a kind of injustice. These feelings tangled together, unresolved and overwhelming. In labor details and barracks, women observed each other closely, recognizing grief without needing it named. They noticed who stared too long at nothing, who flinched at children's voices, who avoided places where mothers and children had once gathered. Trauma created its own silent language, understood instantly by those who shared it. Night was the worst. Exhaustion could not always override memory. Women dreamed of children calling out, of missed chances, of moments replayed endlessly with imagined alternatives. Waking brought no relief, only the return of reality. Some women dreaded sleep more than hunger or labor, because dreams reopened wounds that daylight kept numb. Guilt followed grief relentlessly. Mothers questioned every decision they had made, every route not taken, every moment of hesitation. Rational understanding offered no comfort. The mind knew the truth. The heart refused it. Survivors carried questions with no answers, replaying the past in search of a different ending that never existed. For women who had been forced to abandon children in order to survive, the burden was especially heavy. Survival itself felt like evidence against them. They avoided others' eyes, fearing judgment even where none was offered. Some withdrew entirely, isolating themselves emotionally to avoid pain that felt unbearable. Yet, despite everything, women continued to act. They stood in line. They worked. They followed orders. This persistence was not hope. It was momentum. Life continued because it had not yet ended. Many women described feeling as though they were moving through the world from a distance, watching themselves perform tasks without feeling fully present. Occasionally, moments of connection broke through the numbness. A shared story, a remembered lullaby hummed softly, a child in another barracks who resembled one they had lost. These moments were both painful and sustaining. They reminded women of what had been taken, but also of what had once existed, and therefore, what had meaning. Some women made deliberate efforts to preserve memory. They spoke children's names aloud, even when doing so risked emotional collapse. They described them to others, detailing favorite habits, expressions, dreams. They feared that if they stopped speaking, the children would vanish completely. Memory became a duty, as vital as food or rest. The loss of children also reshaped women's sense of the future. Many could not imagine life beyond the present. Plans felt meaningless. Survival past the next day seemed irrelevant without those they loved. Others clung fiercely to the idea of bearing witness, of surviving so that someone could remember what had been done. Purpose, when it existed at all, was rooted in memory rather than hope. Women without children formed new, intense bonds with each other. They became sisters, substitutes for the families they had lost. These relationships were fragile but powerful, offering mutual support in a world stripped of tenderness. Loyalty was fierce. Loss was shared. Survival became collective again, if only in small groups. At times, anger surged unexpectedly. Anger at guards, at the system, at the world beyond the fences that allowed this to happen, at fate itself. Women learned to suppress this anger, because expressing it could be fatal. But internally, it burned, fueling endurance, sharpening resolve in ways that despair alone could not. As days blurred into weeks, women began to understand that motherhood did not end with the loss of children. It transformed. The instincts remained: protect, nurture, remember. Even when their original objects were gone, women carried this transformed motherhood into everything they did, shaping their interactions, their choices, their will to persist. Some women spoke to their children in their minds, narrating daily events, sharing thoughts, as if the children were still present. This internal dialogue provided comfort and pain in equal measure. It kept relationships alive internally, even as external reality denied them. In rare moments, women encountered children who had survived, orphans wandering camps, lost and terrified. Mothers without children often gravitated toward them instinctively, offering comfort, guidance, protection when possible. These connections were fleeting and dangerous, but they mattered profoundly. For a moment, care found an outlet again. The system did not anticipate this resilience. It sought to sever bonds permanently, to leave individuals isolated and broken. It succeeded in many ways, but it did not fully extinguish women's capacity to love, to remember, to attach meaning to existence, even after unimaginable loss. As the days passed, women realized that their survival now carried a different weight. It was no longer about protecting children. It was about carrying forward their memory, about ensuring that the children who were gone would not disappear into silence. And as women stood in lines, marched between barracks, labored until their bodies trembled, they carried invisible companions with them. Children remembered in every step, every breath, every act of endurance, knowing that if they survived, those children would survive too, at least in memory. Chapter 14. Holding on to humanity. What the system never anticipated was how stubborn humanity could be, even when stripped down to bone and breath. Long after food, family, and certainty were taken away, something remained that could not be inventoried or confiscated. Women felt it most acutely in moments that seemed insignificant to anyone watching from the outside. A shared glance, a hand resting briefly on another's shoulder, a whispered joke that lasted half a second and then vanished into silence. These moments did not change fate. They changed endurance. In the camps and the remnants of the ghettos, women learned that survival was no longer just physical. Bodies could be kept alive through obedience and labor, but spirits were meant to collapse. That was the goal: to reduce people to compliant shapes that moved, worked, and died without inner resistance. Women understood this instinctively. They felt the pressure not only on their bodies, but on their sense of self. And in response, they began to protect what could not be seen. Dignity became an act of rebellion. Women straightened their posture, even when guards demanded submission. They washed their faces with icy water when soap was unavailable. They shared combs, smoothing hair, braiding it carefully, even though it would soon be shorn again. These gestures were not vanity. They were declarations. I am still a person. I still recognize myself. Language became a refuge. Women spoke softly in their own languages when they could, resisting the reduction to shouted commands and numbers. They told stories from before the war, describing streets, kitchens, seasons, ordinary days that felt impossibly distant. These stories were not nostalgia alone. They were anchors, reminders that life had once been expansive and could exist again, somewhere beyond fences and smoke. Humor survived in unexpected forms. Dark, sharp, fleeting. Women exchanged remarks under their breath, jokes so quiet they barely existed. Laughter, when it came, was dangerous, quickly suppressed. And yet it broke through anyway, a release of pressure that reminded them they were still capable of feeling something other than fear. Humor became a pressure valve, brief but vital. Friendship deepened under these conditions in ways few could have imagined before. Women who might never have spoken to each other in another life now became inseparable. They shared food, information, warmth, grief. They learned each other's habits, fears, and strengths intimately. These bonds formed quickly, intensely, because time was short and trust was essential. Friendship became family, forged under threat of annihilation. Care continued, even when resources were non-existent. Women nursed the sick with nothing but water and presence. They sat with the dying, so no one would leave the world entirely alone. They closed eyes, smoothed hair, whispered names. These acts did not save lives. They preserved humanity. They insisted that death, if it came, would not erase personhood completely. Women also preserved ritual where they could. Holidays were marked with words instead of objects. A prayer whispered without candles. A song hummed without music. A moment of silence shared collectively. These rituals were not about tradition for its own sake. They were about continuity, about saying we existed before this, and we will exist after, even if only through memory. The body itself became a site of quiet resistance. Women learned how to conserve energy, how to breathe through pain, how to endure hunger without surrendering mentally. They separated the body from the self when necessary, protecting identity even as the body was exploited. This dissociation was not weakness. It was adaptation, a psychological shield against total collapse. Some women wrote secretly when they could, scratching words into scraps of paper, onto walls, into the margins of forbidden materials. They recorded names, dates, fragments of experience. Others memorized everything, fearing that written evidence would be destroyed. Both forms of record-keeping were acts of defiance against erasure. They insisted that someone would know what happened, even if the women themselves did not survive. Music survived in fragments. A melody hummed during labor. A rhythm tapped out quietly at night. Songs passed from mouth to mouth without instruments or words. Music carried memory and emotion more efficiently than language, bypassing fear and exhaustion. Women closed their eyes and remembered dancing, celebration, weddings, moments when music meant joy instead of survival. Women also taught each other skills, languages, techniques. A woman who knew how to sew showed another how to reinforce seams for warmth. A woman who spoke another language taught phrases that might help in interactions with guards or civilian workers. Knowledge became communal property, shared freely, because hoarding offered no advantage. Teaching sustained minds, even when bodies faltered. Faith took many forms, not all religious. Some women prayed. Others rejected prayer entirely. Faith manifested instead as belief in meaning, in memory, in the importance of surviving to bear witness. Women respected these differences, rarely arguing. There was no energy left for ideological division. What mattered was endurance, however it was achieved. Children, when present, became focal points for this preservation of humanity. Women shielded them from the worst sights when possible, distracted them with stories, games, invented lessons. They reminded children to say thank you, to share, to apologize. Manners became a form of resistance, a way of insisting that civility still mattered in a world that denied it. For women without children, this energy flowed outward into care for others. They adopted roles as mentors, protectors, listeners. They watched for signs of despair, intervened when someone seemed close to giving up. A word spoken at the right moment could mean survival. Women learned to recognize these moments instinctively, stepping in quietly, without fanfare. The system relied on isolation to destroy morale. Women countered with connection. They formed small circles of mutual support, watching out for each other, coordinating movements, sharing warnings. These networks were fragile, constantly disrupted by transfers, deaths, deportations. And yet they were formed again and again, because women understood that isolation was as lethal as starvation. Even language imposed by the system was subtly resisted. Numbers replaced names, but women continued to use names among themselves. They insisted on individuality where uniformity was enforced. Saying a name aloud was an assertion of existence. Remembering a name was an act of defiance. Hope changed shape during this period. It no longer meant imagining a specific future. Instead, it became momentary. Hope that someone would survive the night. Hope that a friend would make it through labor. Hope that memory itself would endure. This scaled-down hope was more sustainable, less likely to shatter completely. Women also learned to manage despair. They recognized when it threatened to overwhelm someone and intervened with practical support. Sit here. Drink this. Rest now. We will think later. Survival became a series of small instructions repeated endlessly, grounding people in the present moment when the future felt unbearable. There were moments when humanity faltered, when exhaustion bred cruelty, when hunger sharpened selfishness. Women acknowledged these moments without judgment. They understood that breaking points were inevitable. Compassion extended even to those who failed, because failure itself was part of the system's design. As liberation rumors circulated, often false, sometimes cruel, women learned to temper hope carefully. Too much hope could destroy morale when it collapsed. Too little could extinguish the will to live. Women balanced on this edge constantly, encouraging endurance without promising rescue. Toward the end, as the war's momentum shifted and conditions changed unpredictably, women sensed that something was approaching. Not salvation exactly, but transformation. The system that had seemed absolute was showing cracks. Guards were nervous, orders contradictory, violence erratic. Women observed these changes with cautious attention, unwilling to trust appearances, but alert to possibility. Throughout all of this, women carried their humanity deliberately, consciously, stubbornly. They protected it the way they once protected children, with vigilance and sacrifice. They knew that even if their bodies did not survive, what they preserved mattered. Humanity, for them, was not an abstract concept. It was a series of choices made under unbearable pressure. To share, to remember, to care, to refuse complete dehumanization, even when survival seemed to demand it. And as days blurred and the structure of the system began to strain under forces beyond its control, women stood quietly within it, holding on to humanity not as a guarantee of survival, but as proof that survival had meaning. Because if anything endured beyond the fences and smoke, it would not be the cruelty that tried to erase them. It would be the humanity they refused to surrender. Chapter 15. After the walls fell. When the gates finally opened, it did not feel like freedom. There was no single moment that announced the end, no clean line between captivity and release. For many women, liberation arrived quietly, almost awkwardly, like a stranger who did not know where to stand. The guards were gone. The shouting had stopped. The rules that had governed every breath simply dissolved. And in the sudden absence of terror, women were left with something far more difficult to confront: what remained of themselves. The first sensation was confusion. Women stood still, unsure what to do with bodies that no longer had a move on command. The habits of survival clung stubbornly. They waited for orders that never came. They flinched at sudden sounds. They hid food instinctively, even when there was no longer a reason to do so. Freedom, when it arrived, felt unreal, fragile, something that could be taken away at any moment. The camps and emptied ghettos revealed their full devastation only after the system collapsed. Women walked through spaces that had once been crowded beyond endurance and were now silent. Barracks stood half empty. Streets were littered with debris, with objects stripped of owners and meaning. Shoes lay scattered, pots rusted in corners. Names were everywhere and nowhere at once. Women recognized these remnants immediately. They did not need explanations. Each object carried the weight of a life that had been erased. For many women, the first instinct after liberation was to search. They looked for children, for parents, for sisters, for anyone whose fate had remained uncertain. They moved through lists, through hospitals, through refugee centers, asking names again and again. Hope flickered and dimmed with each answer. Sometimes a name appeared on a list of survivors, and the relief was overwhelming, almost painful. More often, the lists ended without answers, leaving women suspended in a grief that had no closure. Mothers searched with a desperation that defied reason. They described children to strangers, to officials, to anyone who might listen. Age, hair color, a scar on the knee, a habit of biting nails. Each detail felt essential, as if accuracy itself might summon a miracle. Many women searched for years. Some never stopped. The absence of certainty became a permanent companion, shaping the rest of their lives. For women who found surviving children, reunions were both joyous and devastating. Children had changed. They were thinner, quieter, older in ways no child should be. Some did not recognize their mothers at first. Some recoiled from touch, conditioned by loss and fear. Women embraced them anyway, holding on with a force that spoke of everything they had endured. Love had survived, but it was no longer innocent. For women who did not find their children, survival became a complicated burden. Liberation did not erase loss. It magnified it. The noise of the world returning, voices, traffic, laughter, felt intrusive, even cruel. Women struggled to understand how life could resume when so much had been destroyed. They carried grief into streets that were rebuilding, into societies eager to move forward, often without looking back. The practical challenges of survival did not end with liberation. Women were weak, malnourished, Illinois. Many had no homes to return to, no families waiting. Cities they once knew had changed, or no longer wanted them back. Anti-Semitism did not vanish with the war. Women encountered hostility, indifference, disbelief. Some were told to forget, to be grateful they had survived, as if survival erased suffering. Bodies carried the marks of everything endured. Chronic hunger had reshaped metabolism. Illnesses untreated during captivity lingered. Women struggled with exhaustion that rest could not cure. Many bore injuries, scars, conditions that would affect them for the rest of their lives. And beneath the physical damage lay trauma that medicine could not easily address. Nightmares haunted sleep. Sounds triggered panic. Crowded spaces felt suffocating. Women startled easily, their nervous systems still wired for danger. Trauma was not yet a recognized language. Many women had no words for what they experienced. They carried it silently, believing it was simply the price of survival. Motherhood, for those who still carried it, changed forever. Women who had lost children often found it impossible to speak of them without breaking. Some avoided forming new attachments, fearing the pain of loss more than loneliness. Others sought to rebuild families, to reclaim what had been stolen, even as grief remained present. There was no single path forward. Each woman navigated survival differently, shaped by what she had lost and what she had endured. Women who had cared for others in the ghettos and camps often continued to do so after liberation. They became nurses, caregivers, teachers, advocates. Caregiving had become part of their identity, forged under extreme conditions. Helping others gave structure to lives that felt otherwise unmoored. It was a way of transforming suffering into purpose, though the cost remained high. Some women chose silence. They spoke little of the past, focusing instead on rebuilding daily life. Silence was not denial. It was protection. Words felt too fragile to carry experiences so heavy. Other women spoke relentlessly, driven by the fear that if they did not tell their stories, those who had died would disappear completely. Testimony became a form of mourning and resistance. Women wrote memoirs, gave interviews, testified in trials. They described hunger, fear, loss, and endurance in voices that were sometimes steady, sometimes trembling. Each account was an act of courage. To remember was painful. To speak was to relive. But many women believed that bearing witness was a responsibility they owed to those who could not speak for themselves. Memory itself became contested terrain. Some listeners doubted, others minimized. Women learned quickly that survival did not guarantee belief. This was another form of injury, quieter but deeply damaging. And yet, women persisted, repeating their stories until they were heard, or until exhaustion forced them to stop. As years passed, women aged into a world that often failed to understand them. Their resilience was praised. Their suffering was sometimes romanticized. Few understood the cost of that resilience, the constant effort required to function, to love, to trust again. Women carried the past into every new beginning, shaping identities that were complex, fractured, and profound. Children born after the war grew up under the shadow of these experiences. Women struggled to protect them from inherited trauma while still honoring memory. They balanced silence and truth carefully, aware that forgetting was dangerous, but reliving everything could be equally harmful. Motherhood after catastrophe required new strategies, new sensitivities, new forms of love. For women who never rebuilt families, community became essential. Survivor networks formed, offering understanding where society could not. Shared experience created bonds that transcended language and geography. Women recognized each other instantly, often without words. Trauma had its own quiet signals. As decades passed, the physical spaces of ghettos and camps changed. Walls were torn down, buildings repurposed, cities rebuilt. Women returned to these places sometimes, standing where homes and kitchens and classrooms had once existed. The absence was palpable. They walked through memory as much as geography, carrying voices only they could hear. The world moved on. History books condensed experiences into chapters, statistics, timelines. Women knew how much was missing. They knew that survival had depended on countless small acts, a shared crust of bread, a hidden lesson, a whispered warning, a mother's refusal to let go. These acts rarely appeared in official narratives. And yet, they had been everything. In old age, many women reflected on what survival had meant. Not victory, not justice. Survival was endurance layered with loss, strength intertwined with grief. It was the knowledge that life continued not because it was fair, but because people insisted on it. Women who had once kept families alive in ghettos carried that legacy forward in quieter ways. Through memory, through testimony, through the values they passed on. They understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that survival was not guaranteed by strength alone, but by connection, care, and the refusal to surrender humanity under any circumstances. When the walls fell, the work did not end. It changed shape. Women continue to hold families together, sometimes real, sometimes remembered, long after the physical structures of oppression were gone. Their survival did not undo what had been done, but it ensured that what had happened would not vanish into silence. And in that act of endurance, stretched across generations, the women who kept families alive in the ghettos continued to do so, long after the world that tried to destroy them had collapsed.